You guys might need to share the link on your Twitters. Let's see.
Hey, Rico. Why you even got your camera on if you gonna have a mask on? What's up with that?
It's fucking Loki. No
He's
mames, güey.
Boricua 1488.
His Boricua 1480. Alright, that was a good one.
Hold on. I was like, I gotta do this voice.
It's for our own safety.
Yeah, COVID compliant.
Sí,
And
güey,
then
es que
some.
anda el cockpit 19.
Can you guys
Que no se enfermen.
share the link on your
Yeah.
Twitter's or
Just realized I'm at 1%, so I'm gonna see how long I can
No,
make this last. Ya ni modo.
just trying to navigate this real quick. Okay. Anyways, I guess we could just start, man. Looks like there's 8 people in here. Puerto Rico needs to become independent. Duarte 809 just came in. What's up, everybody? Welcome to El Pocho Hour. I'm your host, Noel OG del Rancho. We're doing it live today. And we're gonna have a Caribbean edition, focus primarily, I guess, on the relationship between Puerto Rico and Cuba and how they kind of express two ends of Hispanismo and a little bit more about their history as well. So why don't we start with that? Let's start with the history about the islands. Who wants to go first? Angelo?
Well, what I just recently found out is that a main focus of our original, like, quote unquote Spaniard immigrants are actually from the Canary Islands, and that I guess like that as like that Arabic influence too. But like what our island is too is we were the first of the Spanish colonies, and we were also the last. And you can even argue that Cuba's independence war was just America's banker war, because I forget what ship exploded, but that was all a lie. They blamed Spain for sinking it.
Yeah, the U.S. Maine.
It's also because the way the Caribbean islands are placed in like near America, that's a big strategic point for Spain or anyone that can control that.
Yeah.
That's why America, even today, it's friendly with Cuba, but Cuba can't really move anywhere outside of Cuba, except to Venezuela and Nicaragua. But America's always trying to undermine that as well.
Sure. One of the geopolitical realities of Hispanoamerica is that if the Caribbean isn't closed off to outsiders, or the outsiders aren't very tightly controlled, then you basically have the entire continent up for attacks from outside powers. And that was really the struggle, the history of the Spanish Empire in the Caribbean. It was basically them keeping, non-Spanish ships out of it. Alex, I think you have a lot of history on that. Do you want to share some of those points?
Sure. This is basically where the Spanish Empire dropped the ball in many ways. They controlled the Caribbean basin for a very long time, but then after the 30 Years' War, when Spain threw that period of weakness at the end of the Habsburgs before the Bourbons took over, basically the English, Dutch, and French, slowly but slowly, they took this island, they took that island, and the Spanish government didn't care because their main concern was New Spain and Nuevo Granada. But they didn't realize is by giving up, let's say, Jamaica, giving up Martinique, giving up, the Virgin Islands, they were chipping away at how the British and Dutch, the French later become allies, but that's because the King of Spain basically was French. Let's be real. You know what I'm saying? So they were an ally of convenience. And you can argue the French controlled the Spanish Empire in the 1700s. I don't want to admit that, but you could make that argument. But again, by the 1700s, most of the Caribbean, except for the big three, which is Cuba, Hispaniola, and Puerto Rico, and even Hispaniola, in 1697, the Spanish gave 1/3 of the island to France, which became Haiti. Once that began happening, that's how later on the British were able to get people like Simon Bolivar. Don't forget, Simon Bolivar was in Jamaica and got help from the British there. That's where he made contact with the British before he went to London. So the Caribbean is where the Spanish dropped the ball, basically.
And yeah, it's like we have to understand that the first colonies was it Cuba or Santo Domingo? I think it was Santo Domingo, no?
Santo Domingo, yes, was for a little while before Mexico, the capital of the whole of the Americas at one point. You know, and I don't even like to say colonies. They were Spain. They were provinces of Spain, you know? So basically, Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Dominican Republic were the first three original ultramar provinces. And ironically, they were the three last. And don't forget, in 1860, the Dominican Republic rejoined Spain. There was the Restoration War, which was backed by the United States, or really the Union. And when the American Civil War ended, they forced Spain to withdraw from Santo Domingo. But the truth is, most Dominicans, and a lot of Dominicans won't admit it, actually were supporting the crown in the 1863 war.
It's always been like that with the natives on the island in general. When Cortez landed, he's like, I was surprised by like how nice these people were. Like these people like may not know God, but they have God in them because of like how peaceful we were and all that.
Right, you're talking about the Taínos.
Yeah, like he came to the island and the Tejanos were like, "Hi, how you doing? Like this is our island."
Yeah, so I'm showing a map here of the region, and it's really important to understand that essentially the Spanish Empire was all of Florida here. At some point, essentially all these islands. This was called the Spanish Main. They actually called the Americas the Spanish continent for a long time. Even Louisiana, but up until Texas, and then it became kind of the French America. But essentially, if you have Mexico City, which is all the way over here, you guys can see it. It's pretty well protected. Nobody's going to invade that city if you control the Caribbean. And that's what you really notice about, especially the war history between Mexico, the military history between Mexico and the United States. Pretty much what they always do is they send ships straight here because Mexico's belly is just bare open. The only way to protect against that is by essentially having this part and these islands that protect, the bulk of the empire. And so really what happened, at the early part of the empire was that the colonies were, or the viceroyalties, the kingdoms were Cuba and Santo Domingo. Then, once Cortez crossed over and came to Mexico, Mexico City became the de facto center of the entire empire, really. And from that point, it was like the islands got a little bit, abandoned, you could say. I've heard this from some Dominican nationalists, for example, that kind of talk about, essentially how Santo Domingo was abandoned and forgotten. And this was kind of the same dynamic in San Juan.
That's true.
Yeah, right. And I think Cuba, the dynamic was a little bit different, maybe because of its size. But pretty much Havana was the main port of entry once you crossed over the Atlantic.
And I want to piggy up off of what Alex said about right during the time when the Restoration War happened. I think it was 1865, if I'm not mistaken.
63 to 65, yes.
Right. So in 69, Ulysses Grant and Frederick Douglass were interested in the annexation of Santo Domingo to make it the, a state. However, the United States at that, Frederick Douglass had an interest of sending descendants of slave into Samaná, and then brought it up to the legislator that wouldn't it behoove the United States to make the Dominican Republic a state? However, at the time, the United States didn't favor mixed race people
it's going
into statehood. So there was still rift going on right after the Restoration War because the United States had an interest in it. And, we can go next, jump in from Cuba to DR, next to Puerto Rico. We can say next that the United States, I guess, got their payback during the Spanish-American War 20 years later. They said, oh, okay, at least we got Puerto Rico out of it and not DR. So, yeah.
And Cuba de facto, because they established a protectorate over Cuba. And up until Castro, basically the Americans, well, you could say the mafia kicked out the Americans in a way, but that's another story. But up until like the rise of the mafia and Batista, the Americans basically controlled Cuba de facto wise. Let's be real.
Well, and also Dominican Republic. I mean, Dominican Republic's never really had sovereignty outside of the corral that the United States allows it to have.
Except under Trujillo. That was the time of the least American influence, because the first thing Trujillo did when he took power in 33, paid off the Dominican national debt to the U.S. Embassy and told them bye-bye. And for 30 years, the United States kept its hand off DR. Then at the end, when Castro started becoming buddies with, when Trujillo started reaching out, sending feelers out to Castro, that's when they decided to make a move on Trujillo.
I mean, interestingly enough, yes, Trujillo did pay off the external debt of the Dominican Republic, but during the end of Trujillo's, legacy or whatever you want to call it, Trujillo did leave a mission to Balaguer to not let in Che Guevara step foot in Dominican Republic, and that was one of the only countries that Che didn't get to step foot in.
Well, because once Che Guevara sets foot in your country, then the CIA has justification to come in there.
Yeah, and there was also the proximity of being in Dominican Republic right after Trujillo. It's right close to Puerto Rico, and the Puerto Rico in the '60s being basically a vessel of the United States probably also had an impact why Che didn't step foot there. Or into those two countries, or whatever.
Got it.
Yep.
Okay, so somebody else, I think Alex was you. You mentioned that. Oh no, I think it was you, Angelo. That at some point Castro tried to influence Dominican Republic. Right? Is this kind of what you guys were touching on right now?
Yeah, we were touching on that because I had no idea about this. This was something interesting. The DR had a communist party that had Cuban money and Cuban officials.
Yes, so we were just touching up on that with a Dominican historian who told us right during the Dominican Civil War in 1965, there was the Loyalists and there was the Nationalist faction. And Juan Bosch, who was the Loyalist, was flying back and forth into Cuba to form a coalition so that the Dominican Republic would install Juan Bosch as president. However, Juan Balaguer was Trujillo's right-hand man, and Trujillo spoke in parables. He would say things like, something about the airplanes were the birds, and we're going to throw you off the airplanes if a communist ever steps foot in Dominican Republic to ruin, because now you're going to ruin everything that we have accomplished in the past 30 years under Trujillo's regime.
Yeah.
Right after the Dominican Civil War in '65, Balaguer was president, and we know that period as the 12 years, right, under Balaguer's now regime, who was backed by the United States, Nixon, etc. Balaguer had a notorious history of giving American presidents like a Dominican handmade mesadora, right, which is like a rocking chair. We call them mesadoras, and that's what came afterwards after the Dominican Civil War.
One thing to mention though about the Dominican Civil War, it was a little bit complex because Juan Bosch was elected constitutionally in 1962, because Balaguer was president after Trujillo. They had an election, and Juan Bosch won the election. He was overthrown by Wessing and Wessing, And what happened was you had a Movimiento Constitucionalista, the Constitutionalist. And yes, there was a Cuban communist faction, but surprisingly, there was also a Trujillista faction led by Monte Arache. And these guys were hard right. You can even say Phalangists. And they fought alongside the communists against the Americans and the army of Wessing and Wessing in '65. So even though there was a Cuban influence, there was also Dominican right-wing influence fighting alongside these Cuban-led communists. And it was basically, to me, Hispanismo against Pygmyism in some ways.
Yeah, and all of our especially even Nicaragua, they all share that history of American influence and causing factional divide and seeing weird alliances.
I do want to give the viewers a fraction of who the coalitions were. So I'm reading through it right now. So the Dominican Republic's Loyalist Faction, Wesson, Lyndon B. Johnson, Brazil, Paraguay, versus the Constitutionalist faction that was Juan Bosch and Francisco Camaño. So the United States had sent in the military. 44 of them died, and 500 Dominicans were killed. And after that war, the result was that the Loyalists won, but they, disposed Juan Bosch's presidency. And then that came Joaquin Balaguer as the new president, who was Trujillo's right-hand man.
And I mean, what are the? I'm trying to figure out like what are the ramifications of all this on a macro scale?
Right. So, diving into who Joaquin Balaguer was, he was this Catalonian lawyer from a wealthy family. I think he was also half Puerto Rican.
Yes, he was half Puerto Rican.
Half Puerto Rican. So he was, someone of influence in the Dominican Republic. Because I think he was Trujillo's prosecutor, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes.
But as was mentioned earlier, Joaquin Balaguer,
Why does he have a French last name?
He was Catalan.
Catalan.
Are you sure? I mean, is that the thing that
he's a real Haitian?
Balaguer is a common, prominent Dominican last name of families who are of Catalan influence that are now in the Dominican Republic. But the point was, during those 12 years of Balaguer's regime, there was presidencies occurring in the Dominican Republic, but he had a history that the news will report, en la Dominicana se fue la luz. And it was because he was losing the election. He was democratically losing the election, and he was up against, say, Peña Gomez, who was the most popular opposition. And in the morning, when the electricity returned, the results showed that Balaguer had won. So the argument was that there was funny business in the election. Balaguer had strong relationships with DC. He also censored journalists who spoke against his regime.
Now, wait, let me understand the time frame here. Was this before or after Trujillo's power?
This was after Trujillo's power. So Juan Bosch was only president of DR for, I would say, 2 or 3 months. And then he was toppled, and Balaguer was installed as president. So this was just right after the Dominican Civil War.
But this is where it gets interesting. In that election in '94, that Peña Gomez really won, that they threw to Balaguer, the Americans forced Balaguer out because they were because Clinton was supporting Peña Gomez. So basically, as we see what happens in Hispanoamerica, once the guy's not useful to the Americans, they get rid of him. Ask Manuel Noriega.
Got it. So Balaguer kind of kept things going for Trujillo. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, and Balaguer put up this front that the Dominican Republic is holding democratic elections, quote unquote holding. I just told you one of the ways
got it.
That he would rig the elections.
Thing about Balaguer, he was very much Hispanista. Like, he was really proud of that connection Santo Domingo had to Spain. Like, he built a mausoleum in Faro de Colón to Christopher Columbus, who's allegedly buried there. He renovated the capital city. So he's a mixed bag. Was he an American tool? Yeah, up until the end. But he also had this Hispanista streak. So he was kind of a contradiction.
Okay.
It's kind of like Batista. Like, he tried to give like Cuba more independence and all that. And then the U.S. is like, you need to knock that off.
Right.
It's hard to judge these people because I wasn't in their shoes, and like neither would I want to be.
Sure. Well, the reality is that the U.S. never liked military governments of Hispanoamerica.
No, they don't, and we keep bringing up that word democratic, like it actually means something to us. It doesn't have to. Like, if you notice, our nations do well with this like strong man leader type, like the father, moving us forward.
Yeah, yeah, they never liked that. Even governments like that kind of have a streak for it, like Somoza or Pinochet.
They got rid of him. They got
I
rid of
bet-
Pinochet in 90.
and Somoza too. At best these governments were tolerated, but they were never ideal for the American system. It's kind of like while America was wrestling with commies, this is the next best thing. But in reality, we don't want these guys either. We want, these kind of weak democracies that are constantly, at each other's necks.
Because they know we're crafty and ballsy. Like, we'll work with you, but like once we gain enough power, it's like, oh, we're gonna send some dudes to Puerto Rico to open up their own journal, like that's pro us.
Right.
Like, nope.
When with Somoza, they kind of turned. They kind of gave gave him a blind eye because Somoza was planning to build what is it called? Thermal stations, right? For power generation. And Nicaragua has a lot of volcanoes. So basically he was going to be able to power electricity of all Central America. And that's going to piss off the oil industry and the Rockefellers who own the oil industry. And actually one of the Rockefellers went down to see Somoza and basically told him, like, don't go through with this because we want you guys dependent on our oil. And Somoza didn't listen. And so they basically kind of just pulled back and, let the Sandinistas take over. So that kind of story of like the U.S. didn't want the Sandinistas in is kind of a lie. They kind of did want the Sandinistas in.
And it's funny you bring up oil because you know how like nations used to fight for ports in the Caribbean.
Right.
Now it's oil rigs.
Right.
Yeah, it's oil.
Yeah, exactly. It changed from that. Let's go back a little bit into the history of it, since we touched on that. So,
guys, I just want to say something real quick. Just
Yeah.
interesting thing on Balaguer. I have it up here. Balaguer was born on 1st of November 1906 in Villa Bisoño, known as Navarrete, Santiago province in the northwest corner of the Dominican Republic. His father, Joaquin Jesus Balaguer Lespier, was a Puerto Rican of native and Catalan ancestry. His mom, Carmen Celia Heru, daughter Manuel Jesus Ricardo Rosia Amelia Heru, who was half cousin of President Ulysses Heru. So Balaguer was related to Haitian because President Heru was Haitian.
So he was Haitian.
No. Through his maternal side, he had a Haitian connection. But his father's side was Puerto Rican Catalan. And that's another thing I'll bring up later. A lot of Catalans sell it in Puerto Rico.
And also to piggyback off what you said, Balaguer was also really popular amongst Dominicans because his economic model, although he was, buddy with the U.S., Lyndon B., etc., he also preserved like corporatism. It wasn't like any free market capitalism. There were things, national parks, cathedrals, prior to him that were being preserved, forestation. If Gancho, I don't know if you're able to pull up a picture of Haiti and Dominican forestation. Right. There's a big contrast that's always spoke about when climate change is being talked about in the UN. How the Dominican Republic, reserved logging. It was illegal to log in the DR to, mine gold because Balaguer protected these.
Forests.
These forests and these national, the beauty of a country that
I'm sure they like that.
Yeah, and that's where they got.
That's not exclusive to DR. That's an all. We all have something that we admire.
Right.
That's why they got rid of Balaguer in 1994. Because keep in mind, Balaguer was useful during the Cold War, anti-communist and that. When the Cold War ended in '89, what came after the Cold War? Globalization. Balaguer did not want to privatize the Dominican economy. He didn't feel Dominican companies should be owned by multinationals. So guess what? In '94, they wanted Peña Gomez. He stole the election. Bill Clinton forced him out. He was no longer useful.
Right.
From my knowledge, that is right. Globalization came afterwards, but Balaguer also gave a handoff to Leonel Fernandez, who was elected in '96.
Yeah, he had no choice, though.
He had no choice, and Leonel, Balaguer was of the party of Partido Cristiano Social, and
Partido Reformista Social Cristiano, and Leonel Fernandez, El Partido de Liberación Dominicana, which was founded by Juan Bosch. Talk about the irony of history.
Talk about the irony. Let's get it.
Right. So, okay, let's go back a little bit to the history here of the region. So one of the dynamics was that, again, the islands were the first colonies, and subsequently they were the last to leave. And they, all the mainland basically was independent by the 1820s, whereas these countries were never independent until basically 1900. And to say that they were independent, I think, is a lie, because basically what happened is the U.S. stole the islands from Spain. The last remaining bits of Spanish presence in the Americas was taken out during the Spanish-American War, which we would all, remember things like the Rough Riders and what's this dude's name? Teddy Roosevelt. And that's really when the whole kind of the big shtick was introduced. And I think one of the things that I want to expand on in the show today is I think in Puerto Rico, you see a very interesting case because, Cuba did have independence, right? They did have Jose Marti. Dominican Republic did achieve independence, but Puerto Rico never did. I always kind of jokingly refer to Puerto Rico as like the little brother of Hispanoamerica, because it's like he's like the baby who was like under mom's skirt the whole time. They never really fought against Spain. They were essentially stolen by, and then Uncle Sam kind of stole Puerto Rico, but they never had independence. So they never, they've always been stuck in a weird kind of thing where it's like they're trying to be Puerto Rican, but at the same time, there's so much influence from the United States that doesn't really quite allow them to be. And then today, we get to the title of today's stream, which is why Puerto Ricans never have good takes or keep having bad takes. Say it again.
Because of Bad Bunny, they lost all accountability.
Yeah,
no, exactly. But realistically, as I was talking about this, is the few Puerto Rican independent people, separatist revolutionaries, they got hijacked. Like the Puerto Rican independence movement dude is some faggot. He's the gay Taino. Like they don't even have that element no more. Their independence is based in Western gay shit. Because they want to, their independence is they want to separate from the machismo culture, the Hispanic culture. They want to form their new age spirituality, gay Taino, independence.
So basically, the independence movement in Puerto Rico became like American liberal. It's no longer labor liberal. It's identity liberal.
They think America is bad, right? But they think Hispanic old school culture is terrible. These motherfuckers ban cockfighting. My dad took me to a cockfight when I was 6 years old. That's just culture.
Yeah, and so then today we kind of exchanged a little bit with a Puerto Rican pick-me, who kind of falls on the other extreme where I don't know how to describe it. Do they think they're pure? It's kind of like the Andy. It's the Andy take. It's the Andes of Puerto Rico.
I think the thing with the Puerto Rican pick-me is, and I can kind of understand this, is because the Puerto Ricans have done a lot for America, especially in times of war and service and civil duty. They have done a lot. America realistically owes them a lot, and they think America's going to give it to them, but America don't care.
Well, it's critical also that we understand that Puerto Rico didn't have any independent movements up until it became a U.S. territory, right? So Puerto Rico was, perfectly.
Was there an independent movement before America took it over?
No, I want to. One of the funny things that I remember growing up hearing about my New Yorker teachers, who had strong pride in New Yorkers, not exactly the Puerto Ricans on the island. She would argue that it was just a handoff. Spain had given up on Puerto Rico and knew what was coming next. In 1898.
Yeah, true. Well, what happened by then is that basically the big engine that was Spain ran out of gas, and their navy was completely obsolete. And it was at that point the Spanish Empire was a sick old man who really couldn't offer a fight to anything.
And the culture changed too. They became Francophile by that point, which we see the end result today.
Well, yeah, I think those two things come together. The destruction of the empire came because of Francization, I would say.
I would even debate that and say Spain was like the last like strong man of Europe up until Franco, because that man had an old school belief that survived after the Second World War. But then after that, Spain lost its dad again, and it fucking died.
No, I agree. Franco was the last gasp of Hispanidad in Iberia.
Franco was the last Spaniard in Spain.
Yep, just like we say Justinian was the last Roman or whatever Roman. Franco was the last Spaniard. He was the last guy who could claim to be an heir of Philip II, And he was Hispanista. He was Franco. He was.
Do you guys know anything about Franco's relationship with Castro?
Yes, they got along very well. Franco refused to go along with the American embargo.
I just need to wait for these niggas to start talking about Dominican Arianism.
Andy?
Well, no,
okay.
No,
Topic at a time.
I was gonna say the Franco-Castro relationship is tied into Galicia, and Galicia being the recent immigrants, the ones that left to do labor in Cuba, the ones Castro's father stayed in Cuba after the Spanish-American War. He said, I found a new home in Cuba.
Also, Cuba,
got it.
Even up today has I read somewhere that it has the highest amount of Spaniards that go and move there out of all the Latin American countries.
Yeah, they're still because they were the first three. There's still an attachment to Spain in those three islands.
And that big wave of right after the Spanish-American War and the Spanish Civil War, during that 40-year period, it was Galicians who were, arriving in Cuba. Because before that, it was the Isla Canaria that was there, that was established.
There was even a lot of there was a couple people that even fought for Spain in World War II that moved to Cuba right after the war.
Right. That also happened in Mexico too.
Yeah, it's weird. Spain, the real Spanish people that still want to be Spanish come to us. We don't go to them.
Right.
And they always married a mixed race woman. Not a coincidence.
Mm-hmm.
Right. I mean, look at Fidel Castro's father. Right after the war, he went back. He went back into Galicia and said, "You know what? Being a stonemason here sucks. At least in Cuba, I already established a relationship. As a matter of fact, I think Cuba, Castro's father was a wealthy rancher, and he said, I'm leaving. I'm going back to Cuba," and he established himself there.
A woman actually broke his heart too. That's why he left too. He's like, "Oh, where are
What's that, dude?
But getting back to Puerto Rico, there was no real Puerto Rican independence movement against Spain. There was something that Puerto Rican nationalists had made up called El Noche de los Lloras. I don't know, something like that. It turned out it was Venezuelans. It was Venezuelans behind it, not Puerto Ricans.
You're talking about El Grito del Are. Betances. Yeah, that was like a Masonic movement, but it was so, it's like when you light a firecracker and it doesn't even make a noise. It was like one of those fake things. It wasn't organic at all. That's why I say no, that there wasn't.
Exactly. Puerto Ricans, up until the American takeover, they viewed themselves as Español. They viewed themselves una provincia de España, de la Corona. They were very loyal to the crown.
I would say the last real, this is a stretch, but the last real Puerto Rican independence movement was the Latin Kings.
I agree.
Yeah.
They were pan-Hispanista, actually, in a lot of ways.
Yep.
Yeah.
The Latin Kings weren't a gang. They would take you in and teach you history and shit. No other gang does that.
That's why I got along with them. I used to speak about the Spanish Empire with them.
Other gangs do that. In prison, they do.
Real quick, can we touch on what was happening before Puerto Rico became a state? I just want to viewers, like get a gauge what was going on in Puerto Rico right before it was handed off to the U.S.
Yeah,
I think that's crucial.
Leo was here, he could fill us in, but maybe Inquisidor, you know something about that.
So what was the question again? De Puerto Rico?
What was going on in Puerto Rico before the United States took it over? Like, what was its status? What was the situation there?
Well, so at that point, Puerto Rico had become a fully integrated autonomous province of Spain. Basically like any other region of Spain, right? Where representation and government and all that. So it was like fully integrated. And that was really the height of our prosperity. If you look at all the numbers and paper as far as it's just general prosperity. That was the tippity top of Puerto Rico's economic and maybe you could even say cultural height was right there. And so everything was good, really, it's a shame that right after that happened, I
don't know if it's a joke or not, but obviously that was happening, and there was a strong relationship with Puerto Rico, Catalan, and there was still commerce going on. It's that and the third, but the rumor was, right before the U.S. got a hold of Puerto Rico, was it that Catalan sent all their prisoners, and Dominicans, we would always joke in Bodega that the Lion Kings were descendants of those prisoners. Going, with the sword and whatnot, like to fight. They were fighters.
Well, some of the Latin king symbols actually come from the crown of Aragon. I'm not making this up.
And the flag, and then some. There's a lot. There's a strong linkage to
even the colors. Black and gold.
Is what they
say it again.
Even their colors, like black and gold and all that, like I know it's a meme, but like they were really trying to uplift the like Hispanic youth into teaching them that they were like descendant of kings on both sides.
Get Wi-Fi anywhere you go.
God damn it. Who is that? I'm gonna have to kick these niggas.
Yeah, I think so.
But talking about the Latin kings, what do you call it? Like that chant where they say "Amor de Rey," that comes from the crown of Aragon. Before the Aragonese would go into battle, before their king, they would say "Amor al Rey." Yeah, it came from Aragon.
Right. I mean, it was the Lion Kings was kind of like a mutual aid society that kind of became a gang, or kind of danced between those two roles.
And talking about the Latin Kings and what they established in New York. The Dominicans had something similar to that. It was called the Patria Trinitarios. The Trinitarios were the three founders, Guatemala, and who was the third one?
Sanchez.
Guatemala Sanchez. It was Dios, Patria, and Libertad, which was the chant that the Patrias would say, Dios, Patria, Libertad, and they would, mention the Trinitarios. Very similar to the Lion Kings and what they had going on.
Right. Okay, let's go back a bit here to the history. So these countries never really had independence until the US butted in. Cuba did eventually become independent, but it was still largely a satellite of the United States. Essentially, for a long time it was ran by, or the mafia had a big influence on the island. Not just the Italian, but the J Mafia especially. But with Puerto Rico, it never had that. It's always been kind of in this quasi state. And I think now, like, there's a lot of Puerto Ricans who are looking for statehood. It seems like the Puerto Rican hardliners that don't want statehood, that just want to be an independent country, I think would be a minority. I think it's probably more, there's probably more Puerto Ricans that might be involved with the kind of rejoining Spain movement, right? But from what I know, that movement also isn't that big compared to the other ones.
It's hard to say, because it's never been in un plebiscito, as they call it. It hasn't been polled. So, you always suspect the worst. And so you want to assume that it's very small, but we'll never really truly know until it's on the ballot in some sort of expression.
The U.S. will never allow it on the ballot. We all know this.
Right.
Well, yeah, that too. Yeah, even the party leader, Jose Nieve, he has a following like us, but they won't. That even the radio stations don't touch him over there.
Then let's get him on the show.
Probably would come on.
We could. Yeah, I think so. I haven't heard him speak English. That might be a thing, but I'm sure like you could speak.
And then we
some
get Evo
broken English.
Morales.
And if
Oh my God!
Go ahead.
Puerto Rico had an election on statehood recently. I don't know if it was last year or 2 years ago.
Yeah, those happen frequently. Like every 8 years, seems like there's one.
Realmente, the turnout was 30% of the population. I don't know if Rancho, if it's possible that.
Yeah, I pull it up right here. So
there we go.
52% of voters are from whoever showed up. They said yes.
Yeah.
Man, these niggas are annoying, bro.
Y quítate al otro tipo ese también.
Yeah.
That other 1488.
Anyways.
You gotta come 1492, not 1488.
Exactly. You know what 1488 is? That's a Nazi shit. It's not our shit.
I know. He was being funny. I think I know who it is. He was just being funny.
Okay.
I think he was trying to make fun of the Puerto Rican kid that was the pick-me from earlier that basically can't. And this is what I wanted to touch on. That it's like, to go back to this election, it's like, I think the point is that where the hell is the election? There it is. The point is that Puerto Ricans feel like the situation they're in is not the ideal. Either like, let's become a state or let's become independent, but we really can't become independent because, we're kind of a small island. So we need to join something bigger. And so I guess the best thing on the table at this point, at least from their perspective, is to rejoin Spain somehow.
Right. And I want to touch on, are we able to see the voter turnout? Because I sympathize with the Puerto Ricans. I know a lot of them are disengaged on the island with this measures because they know that it's like, let's not even bother. Like, we want.
Well, no, it doesn't say. It doesn't say the turnout.
I brought this up. Like, it's hard, and it's probably almost near impossible for Puerto Rico to survive on its own without being like in a union with the other islands or being part of America or somebody else. So if anything, it should probably just trade with its other Caribbean nations and get rid of America, but that's impossible right now.
There's no framework,
Yeah.
that exists. God damn it. Anyways, go ahead.
Sheesh. No, I was going to say, they have three options. So we see Commonwealth, statehood, independence. I don't know what free association means, but, there's a dissatisfaction when this ballot measure comes up in Puerto Rico.
Well, you could see only about 30% of the people even bother to vote on that, right? Because we see just what? Just like 1 million, right? 500,000, 600,000, and there's 3 million people in the island, so you could say about a third voted.
And I want to say, obviously, we're all fed up with these options, but then I do want to mention something really interesting that I saw on Twitter by AOC, the congresswoman from the Puerto Rican congresswoman from the Bronx, Queens area. She said the best option for Puerto Rico was something of independence and reparations that the United States must pay back to Puerto Rico. So, there's there's a lot going, and then there's the independence who is the Taino that's lost out his mind that we see on Twitter. Yeah, there's
So that's what I want to get into. I want to understand kind of Puerto Rican culture and why, I think we all understand why, but like I want to expand on that. Why did it develop this way? Why do you have this phenomenon of, fairly fair-skinned Puerto Ricans claiming to be Taino? I think one of the things we need to point out about Puerto Rico is that it has the lowest fertility rate in the world, I believe, especially from Hispanoamerica. But basically, they're like beyond negative reproductive rate, and I understand there's a big chunk of the diaspora. I want to understand a little bit more of that. How New Yorkers and Puerto Ricans relate. And then, again, how you see this kind of Latinx or Taino AOC thing where we're like black and we deserve.
Oh, that's a Sephardic woman.
Oh, that's true. Or you see the other opposite, where is like, we're Scandinavian on a tropical island, basically, which is just kind of another pathetic LARP. Inquisidor, can you school me a bit on that?
Yeah. So before getting into that, I wanted to touch a little bit about Puerto Rico not being able to be self-sufficient. Not that I ever would want it to be on its own, because it's a small part of something much greater. But that has to do a lot with industry. And Puerto Rico, like most of the islands, was very productive agriculturally. Mm-hmm. Produced a lot of sugar, a lot of coffee, a lot of tobacco too. That industry's dead. Piña, I mean, you name it. We were very, very, very productive. And then under the United States, all those industries were set to the side, right? Because now all of a sudden we, could import it, or the U.S. would get like some free trade, like cheaper stuff. Kind of like the same thing that happened with Mexico and el maíz, right? Mm-hmm. And then Puerto Rico pretty much developed like this pharmaceutical industry. It was known for that. And then that industry has slowly been leaving to China and other places. And I think that came to the forefront during the so-called COVID pandemic, where Puerto Rico didn't really come through with the pharmaceuticals, because lo and behold, even that was taken from them. So if Puerto Rico does go independent, it's going to be very, very difficult, not because it could not be, but it's just because it's been stripped bare bones, and it would have to develop all these industries almost overnight from scratch. And I think a lot of Boricuas are, don't want to face that reality. Those growing pains, so to speak.
And so they kind of, I guess they kind of stick with, being this kind of Uncle
indentured servitude,
bastard baby, basically.
Yeah. It's like somebody, who I guess you compare it to somebody who at one point had a good physique and was working out, and now they're all flabby and they're addicted. They have addiction problems. And then, they don't want to go back to the gym, That's one way to look at it. But, the dependency, it's a dependency. We become dependent on the United States in a bad way, because it's not even like a good deal. But it's that's kind of the situation you have. We have this dependency going like Estados Unidos, and it's sad. It's sad, but so I think that's why a lot of Puerto Rico
that's done to the culture, right? It's like basically it's removed kind of this like working masculinity from the island, because there's no more farming. Your food comes from outside.
Exactly. So you couple that with all the, all the housing projects that they've built, all the, Puerto Ricans get welfare, they get Medicaid, they get food stamps, right? Obviously not all Puerto Ricans, but this nanny state mentality has also, has encroached, and a lot of people are like that right now.
Bestia brought up this thing that I want to touch on. He said, you remind me of those egocentric white people that always put something European on top of any native idea or vengeance. Because he said that I was laughing because Alex, I don't know if somebody can pull up that video of the Puerto Rican Taino who
Martín.
They made this big deal about Taínos inventing barbecue, but it's like you didn't have pork and beef till the Spanish came. So like, what were you barbecuing before? So it's like, why do we need these fake pats on our back? Like, oh yeah, the Taínos invented. Like, what is that? If you break it down, what does that really mean? It's just, maybe the word comes from Taino origin, okay, but it's like, let's not give ourselves these fake pats on the back. Like we do have things to be proud of on the indigenous side, of course. Now, and I think this is something that I want to bring through, because it's like in Puerto Rico, you kind of lost that, and they have this thing where like all the Tainos were killed, but the Tainos weren't really necessarily all killed. Most of them died from disease, but all the ones who survived essentially just married in with the Spaniards. And those are the modern Cubans, Puerto Ricans, and Dominicans today. Correct?
And in that fashion, you could say that, yes, we are Taino when you paint it like that. What this other guy's doing is, it's basically, just typical late 20th century left-wing indigenism. Just, yeah, it's funny because this guy, I don't know him personally, but I've been exchanging, words with him for years on Facebook and these Puerto Rican groups, because he's out there, and a lot of us know him, Martin. And then finally, when I saw that video that one of you guys shared, I was like, whoa, that's Martin. And lo and behold, in the first 5-10 seconds, yeah, pero este tipo es maricón. Because you can see how you can see how he talks, how he,
like he's not a Tejano, he's a fucking faggot.
Yeah.
The best is, hey, this is qué pasaron. By the way, I linked it in the chat, the video. Oh, los abusos, los violaciones. No, you know what happens? He probably has a gay lover who dresses up like conquistador and sticks it up his butt. So that's the only rape that happened to Tainos in his mind. Seriously.
Right.
It's not a bad take. But Rancho, that connects to, remember a few episodes we were talking about indigenism, and we were reviewing these characters that were very feminine, right? And then lo and behold, Martin, my arch nemesis from Facebook, es maricón. Look at that.
Yeah. So I'm gonna try to pull up the video for you guys right now, so you can see who we're talking about. So basically, the point that we're kind of seeing is that, one of the things I always say is that the rejection of our Spanish heritage really is a proxy for a anti-paternalism, right? It's like in our minds, psychologically, we kind of associate our Spanish heritage with kind of our paternalism. It's kind of like the figure of your father. And so if you have daddy issues and, you don't like men being in an authoritative position, then you're going to express that as an Hispano in or you call it Hispanophobia, right? You're going to want to reject your Spanish identity, your Spanish heritage, your Spanish root, or the Spanish effects in our culture. And you're going to want to kind of build something else. So what you see is that every time these people who kind of LARP as indigenous, they tend to be feminist or they tend to be homosexual. And here we see an example of a Puerto Rican man who, let's kind of...
Me and your nigga be chopping it. I'm jacking this dick so he spit in my mouth. Ain't no slurping ass begging for cocking it. Ain't fucking with pussy my blood.
God damn it, dog.
Yeah, yo te dije que sacara ese tipo.
Dog, you're fucking annoying. If it's who I think it is, bitch, you're lucky I don't know where you live. I'm gonna stomp you in the fucking nuts. Okay, let's keep going. So what you notice here when you hear these people talk about, the Spanish were bad, they were rapists, kind of sub in that word for my dad. Like think about him saying my dad.
Siempre mi abuela decía que nosotros veníamos de indígenas. Eso es lo primero. Eso se clavó en mi mente, pero siempre que se buscaba información sobre los taínos nunca aparecía mucha información, sino que decían los indios desaparecieron, los indios murieron, los indios ya no existen. Pero dice, pero es que tiene que quedar algo, porque si todavía queda la raza negra, todavía quedan de los blancos, porque no puede quedar de los indios también. En todas estas cosas, pues fue buscando acordarme de los taínos, porque de ellos nadie se había acordado. sino que lo que hicieron fue que trataron de llevarlo al olvido, claro, para ocultar todos los abusos, violaciones, todos los maltratos y todos aquellos genocidios que hicieron antiguamente. ¿Comprende? Entonces, esa fue la razón por la cual yo comencé todo esto. Entonces yo dije, ¿y qué tal si yo me he visto de indígena? ¿Cómo será la reacción del pueblo? Porque aquí se visten de bomba y a plena, se visten de orilla, se visten de cuántas cosas hay, que no es nuestro, sino que lo adoptaron como parte nuestra. Porque yo no puedo hacerlo con lo mío, con lo del patio, con lo que me pertenece. Entonces, ahí comencé, yo solito. Entonces, cuando comencé, pues, empecé a ver la aceptación, personas se me empezaron a unir. Y hoy día, pues, hay un pueblo, son más de 500 personas que estamos envueltos en todo esto, de la cultura taína. Defendemos la cultura taína a capa y espada y somos promotores de la misma y del orgullo. No nos importa si la persona es rubia, tiene ojos azules, si es jabao. Después que sea puertorriqueño, es taíno oficialmente.
And there's the barbecue again.
So he is right in that last bit que nosotros, tú sabes, si nos preguntan si somos taínos, yo digo, yeah, pues somos taínos, you know, it's
like that, like that's
Not like that. Come on.
They say they're
of course not like
left,
that.
but like they're still here. Like when people tell me that on Twitter, be like, but the Indians, like, what do you mean they're still here? Like,
yeah, that's kind of what I was trying to explain earlier. It's like the Tainos didn't die out; they just fused and morphed into Puerto Ricans, Cubans, and Dominicans. And yeah, I don't think it should be overlooked that there were really huge abuses in the islands. I think the islands was probably the darkest chapter of the conquest history because it was a very early phase of the conquest, right? And for this, Columbus was stripped of his power. I think he was allowed. I had said earlier, I thought he was in prison. He was in prison for a while, but he did manage to retain, you know, a lot of his rewards and wealth and all that stuff. But yes, it was the ugliest phase of the entire conquest happened on the islands. And the Tainos weren't like, you know, the Aztecs or the Mayans. They didn't have these stone cities. They didn't have these sophisticated polities. You know, they were kind of more chill islanders, you know, you can imagine like Hawaiian people, right? So it is unfortunate, but you know, these are things that happen in history. This isn't exclusive to any group or race of people. You know, people beat each other up all the time and take their shit. So, you know, but what did happen is that again, these Tainos fused into the people that we see today from these islands. And though, of course, you're going to have people who may not have any of that blood. But again, you know, when I talk about el mestizaje, it's not so necessarily literal, right? You could be a person who's 100% not Amerindian from Puerto Rico, but you're still a Taino, right? It's like that. It's in the culture. It's in the essence of being Puerto Rican. Same thing with Mexico, right? It's like everyone's kind of imbibed this because the Aztecs have like the most impressive, you know, city and civilization in pre-Columbian Mexico. So everyone's kind of imbibed that, even if they're genetically not related to it. It's just part of el mestizaje.
Yeah, como Martín dice, eres puede ser rubio de ojos azules, and si eres puertorriqueño, you're taíno. I mean, that's just. But the thing is that there's no grievances, right? You go back. You could. I would even dare say 50 years. There's no grievances. What he brings to the table is something new. Something fresh, you know, something that is not organic.
Yeah, and that he even started a Taino community. It's like, and that he accepts even, okay, because where he's coming from, you know, the end statement, todo mundo Puerto Rico son Taino. Okay, that's a fair statement. But the whole thing he's doing with this community, and he's okay with people, because he wants to be a Taino, but he's okay with people who are genetically not Tainos to be a Taino. So he's almost contradicting himself. He wants a reverse mestizaje where the people abandon their Spanish roots and just become Taino, like a reverse mestizaje in many ways.
Yeah, right. This is what, you know, the teacher Paula from New York City, the Dominican lesbian girl, was basically proposing, is that what the Latinx are basically is pushing is that we de-Hispanicize our identity, but that is essentially where we get our names and our language, and history, and so much of our, physical heritage also comes from there. So, Tradcath PR, you're in the show. I want to hear from you. You said you wanted to mention something. Tradcath, where are you, buddy? Okay, he's not listening. Anyways, so let me answer back to Bestia because he was asking questions. So he says we want us to identify as Spaniards. No, I wouldn't ever call myself a Spaniard. I am, of Spanish heritage, right? But I'm an Hispano. And for me, in this continent, Hispano intrinsically means that you've absorbed mestizaje, right? It's another word for mestizo, but mestizo is a racial technical term, especially when you're using it in the context of the United States. Though in Hispanoamerica, when we say mestizaje and we say that we're all mestizos, we're talking about it culturally. Again, in Colombia, you go to a girl who has green eyes and dirty blonde hair, she's going to say she's mestiza. If you go to the, light-skinned mommy from the Caribbean coast, she's also going to say she's mestiza. So they're not looking at it necessarily from a function of race when they say they're mestizo. They're looking at it from a sense of we're Hispano. We are of this continent. We are a fusion, a mixture of these people. So that's what we identify. Now, when we understand hierarchy, when we understand that there is an order to the world, we understand that you come from your father, then we understand that the Spanish root in our identity is our paternal root, right? It comes before our maternal roots, and our maternal roots, are just as necessary. You can't have a baby without a woman, but again, you originate in your father. Somebody had shared a really funny scene. Forget, it was like this kind of funny football sitcom or something where the coach is kind of pepping everybody up and he's saying like pussies are born from their mom, like the alphas come from their daddy's nuts. So you kind of have to understand that there is an order, right? There is an order to the family, right? If you're a man, you're going to have a wife, you are to be the head of your wife, you are to be her provider and protector and her priest. So you are the one to take the bullet first, right? So at the same time, there is a privilege to that burden, to that responsibility. So us giving the Spanish root, not Spaniards today, the Spanish root, the paternal root, is just a recognition of that order. At the same time, what that does is it gives us a universal connection to be able to connect a Mexican and a Puerto Rican, right? Mexicans and Puerto Ricans meet here, they have babies and they have kids, right? Same thing with Cubans and Nicaraguans or Dominicans and Venezuelans. And it's because we're able to connect through our paternal root, that which is universal. Now, our third root, the mestizaje, is unique to us. So the mestizaje of Mexico is very unique to itself, and Mexico is a huge country. So you have various forms of that mestizaje. The mestizaje of Cuba and Puerto Rico and the Dominican Republic is a little bit more similar because you have some of the strong African influence that came in, and so on and so forth. Peru is also different. So again, when we talk about us being Hispano, we're just kind of recognizing our father's last name, but that isn't denying our mother, right? Which is kind of what you see in people like Andy, for example, who kind of rejects the fact that he's clearly, a blonde mulatto. It just looks silly. That's not what all we were saying. And I'm actually positing that because of our maternal root, we have a more legitimate claim to this land, right? Because we're related to the Tainos, right? If you're from the Antillas, you have Taino blood in you, most likely. The Tainos still live amongst in you. So I hope that clears it up.
Hey, OG, something I wanted to point out. If you look at something that just crossed my mind, if you look at that map of the Caribbean, right? The Bahamas, north of Cuba and DR, right? Went under British control, okay? Those outward islands went under British, Dutch, and French control. And then Jamaica and the Caymans went under British control. You notice that Puerto Rico, Cuba, and Hispaniola are basically surrounded. Look at that map.
Wait, say it again. Say it again, buddy.
Okay. Look at that map.
Yeah.
Okay. You have north of Cuba, the Bahamas, right? British controlled. Okay. You have east of Puerto Rico, all those islands, those chain of islands that are British, Dutch, and French control, right? Then to the south of Cuba, you have Jamaica and the Cayman Islands. If you look at what they did, the enemies of Spain chip away, they basically surrounded the 3 islands. And then when the French got Haiti, that cut off Santo Domingo from Cuba. Look at that.
Right.
Look what they did.
Yeah. No,
I don't think that was a coincidence.
No, that was a big L, and it makes sense with the Spanish is that they, the resources are limited. We got to focus on them where we need them, and obviously, the focal points of our empire is Mexico City, Bogota, down Lima, Peru. So they, in a sense, they left the back door open, right? They left this door open, and they ended up paying for it dearly over time. Somebody was going to say something. No. Okay. So, what I want to bring it back to Puerto Rico, because Puerto Rico is like a very interesting place where you see this phenomenon of people rejecting the Spanish route or people having that opposite visceral reaction where it's like, no, I'm I'm an Aryan too. And what needs to be understood, it's like it's because these kids are kind of listening to like white nationalist bullshit online or whatever. And it is explaining some of the stuff that's going on, and I don't necessarily argue against it. But the white nationalists aren't giving you the full story of history. They're giving you a wig-washed version of history that isn't very necessarily fair to your ancestors, their worldview. And if you're all about preserving your heritage, then you need to honor your ancestors and their worldview. The reality is that it seems a lot of Puerto Ricans in the United States don't understand that. Inky Sealer, what would you say about that?
I think that is mostly a phenomenon that occurs in the United States. And what I mean by that is that I know Puerto Ricans from the island who identify with fascism, who admire Hitler, right? They like the National Socialist model and whatnot, right? So they have that Wignatism going on.
Yeah.
But at the same time, they don't identify as white. They understand that they're mixed and they embrace it and they don't have a problem with it at all. It's so you've either more like I guess like Marcus Garvey would be like a good example where he was a nationalist, but it's not like he thought he was white, right?
Yeah.
But something happens with the Puerto Rican in the United States where perhaps because, National Socialism and all that, movement is led by Anglos, then they want to fit in with the Anglos.
Yeah.
So then they start compromising with the Anglos, to fit into the Wignat groups, the so-called pygmies. But again, it's interesting that in Puerto Rico you have National Socialist tendencies, but never do they cater to Anglos. On the contrary, they would probably see them as enemies.
Right. Yeah, I think with the Puerto Ricans, kind of what I've noticed is that they're very disconnected from even their Spanish history. It's like they will claim to be Spanish, but they don't understand what that means philosophically, again, from a position of worldview. And the reality is that, white nationalists don't even consider Spaniards white. They'll consider them some kind of mixture of Arab who just happens to have a Latin language. So even the root, even our paternal root is rejected in this schema. And so, my position has always been to, again, reject this false dialectic, reject the pygmy, shame him publicly, and reject the Latinxer and shame him publicly. Because at the end of the day, we need to understand that even if you have green eyes and blonde hair, you're still a spick, right? And even if you're black, but you speak Spanish and you're from Cuba, you're still a spick. Even if you're Bolivian and you're 100% indigenous, you're still a spick. You're still a Mexican. So we need to understand ourselves civilizationally, right? We need to understand ourselves as a multiracial but monocultural ethnoi. that's bound together by our worldview, manifested in Cristo Rey, Logos incarnate, and our Spanish paternal root, whether it's literal or cultural, it's our language, it's our names, and the celebration of our mestizaje, and how, you know, even though that's different from every region of Latin America, it is another point that brings us together because we're all products of that to a certain extent. Even a place like Argentina, where you don't necessarily have a mestizaje with the indigenous, you still have a mestizaje with the European, right? It's still, you got a Spanish daddy, you just have a white mom.
Yeah, that sounds about right. You know, and then also you could picture that all the Puerto Ricans in Puerto Rico that vote for statehood, they kind of come across as pygmies, right? Obviously, because they want to join the United States. But I would argue that it's more economical than anything. It's more, they see that it's just as economic security, and why not? But you know, the same Puerto Ricans, if you poll them, should English be the official language, you're going to get a hard no, like in the 80, 90 percentile.
Even today, you think amongst the Latinxers?
Bueno, in Puerto Rico, if you do it just in the island, I am confident that, you know, if they say, okay, what's going to be our official language, I'm confident you're going to get at least 70% saying Spanish. I would not be surprised if that would go up to like a 90 percentile. So it's more economic than anything. They don't want to stop being Spanish. They don't want to stop being Puerto Rican. It's just, you know, it's just like a comfort, you know?
Yeah,
so
that's what it is.
I want to ask, so the Puerto Rican diaspora that we know of today in the United States, mostly concentrated in Orlando or New York, what is their relationship to the island? Like, you know,
yeah, that's
well, I know something really unique about Puerto Rico is that, you know, they have access to come here and go back and forth because of citizenship. Yeah.
I could tell you about Orlando. It's an interesting mix. You have a wave of New Yorkers coming down. We also have Puerto Ricans from the island, and there's differences. And I've even heard from like some of my New Yorker friends, man, the Puerto Ricans from the island, like they don't view us as real Puerto Ricans. And then when I've talked to Puerto Ricans from the island, they say, man, New Yorkers, man, they act like Anglos. I'm serious. It's like, or they act like morenos, como negro americano. It's like just funny to see how like these are people who have the same roots, but the ones from New York, like they're viewed as different.
Yeah, that's true. They're the New Yorkers, and we're the Puerto Ricans. It's a very, very complicated thing. I had mentioned in the past, and Carlos, you're seasoned enough that you remember Gremlins, right?
Yep.
So New York is the water. That's you know, for anybody who's seen the movie Gremlins, basically it's just these little fuzzy, cute little creatures, and they make nice pets, but you can't get them wet or feed them past midnight. If you do that, they turn into monsters. And so jokingly, we say that New York is water for Puerto Rican. There's something about, I guess, jam culture. I guess that's probably the main thing that for some reason, and you know, not always, but there's this look of New Yorkers like they've been corrupted, like they.
I have a pure Bavarian phenotype. I'm white, you guys.
There we go. Okay. I don't know how you guys keep getting in.
Well, back to the point. Where does the New York Rican history start? Like, how does that come about? This like subculture. I'm a New York Rican. I'm foreign to Orlando because the ones in the island, you know, don't associate with me that much. What's the history behind that?
1940s and 50s, a lot of Puerto Ricans started moving to New York for industrial jobs because, as we spoke about, the agricultural industry died out in Puerto Rico in the first half of the 1900s. So they started moving up to New York for for jobs. But the first generation was still Hispano. It was the ones who went through school, and they were taught that lie that, the Spaniards went and raped the Taínos, and you guys are a product of rape. That's where it began in the 60s. Then you had the Brown Power movement, and they really began to reject the Spanish returnal route and get obsessed with this Taíno and black thing.
So
They emulated the black Americans.
Did they get integrated?
Yeah. No. To add on to that, right? Because in the 60s, there was the black and brown unity. There was a civil rights movement going on. And the New Yorkers, I don't know if this time they were probably first, second generation. They said, now we're with them because their fight is also our struggle. And
the Young Lords.
The Young Lords, right. Gerardo Rivera, right? He was a part of it.
Gerardo Rivera was one of them. And also the guy from Democracy Now!, Juan Gonzalez, he was also a prominent. But you see, that was not going on in Puerto Rico. At that time, if you fly down to Puerto Rico with your little beret talking, Young Lords, Puerto Ricans are going to look at each other and look at you, and they're going to say, like, get out of here with that crap. Like, that would be like a point, like, to the New Yorican Puerto Rican divide. Like, what are you talking about? Like, and then I think another thing that cannot be been overlooked is that the Puerto Ricans that came over here, they started getting influenced by gringos, black gringos, and specifically, right? Because we lived right next door to them. In Harlem, Fifth Avenue, east of Fifth Avenue was all Puerto Rican, west of Fifth Avenue.
What was known as Spanish Harlem or El Barrio, right?
Yeah, El Barrio, right. Spanish Harlem. So that's Harlem, the east of Fifth Avenue. That used to be, it's still kind of de facto Puerto Rican, but mostly a Spanish neighborhood of everybody now. But in any case, we used to live next to the black gringos, and we kind of started adopting their culture. And when you come back to Puerto Rico and you bring that, the people in Puerto Rico look at you like you're corny, like what is this? Like, why are you LARPing as a black gringo? So that also has to do a lot with the New Yorican Puerto Rican divide. Losing the language, that's another thing too. You come and you don't speak Spanish, immediately that's already like, you're not Puerto Rican. So right. it's a few things, it's I
want to say to add on to what you said about not speaking Spanish. I remember growing up, El Peluquero, the one that recently came from Puerto Rico, he got along with the Dominicans very well. They would open shop together because, this guy was from the island, and in New York, we have more in common with him than he would have with someone who's, his kids will probably be the ones that don't learn Spanish or lose it or something like that. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I absolutely.
Like the ones I went to school with, as opposed to the Puerto Ricans I knew in the barbershop, they were very different because the ones I went to school with were like New Yorkers. They don't speak Spanish, and there was a different, there was a disconnect between them. So
and then there was a splinter of New Yorkers who became part of the generic white Catholic grouping because what happened to the Puerto Ricans, the same thing happened to the Italians and the Irish, where they maintained their culture for a long time. Then in the 1950s, and OG's gone over this, with suburbanization, they lost their culture. Well, what happened was a faction of Puerto Ricans left El Barrio. They moved to places like New Jersey, Long Island, and they just became part of those white people. Even though they were Puerto Rican, they no longer spoke Spanish, and they acted more like, the Italians and the Irish. And by Italians and Irish, I don't mean the real Italians and Irish. I mean some of the ones from New York, that Italians who think they're Anglo-Saxon. I'm not kidding you. I've encountered this. And I'd be like, dude, you're Roman. We share the same blood. Nah, man, that's you spickaroos, not us Italians. We got German in us. Yeah. And I'm like, dude, where the hell you heard that? In school. Seriously.
Right. The joke was that the second generation Puerto Rican who was in NYPD was basically Italian, right?
Yeah, there's a lot of truth to that.
Because before that it was Irish, and then the Italian and Puerto Ricans were able to join the force. But you look at today, it's now a minority majority for us. It's Dominican, Puerto Rican, everyone.
It's funny that the Catholic people always like became the police force. Like that's their gift for being assimilated. Like the Irish were like mostly the police force in New York, then the Italians, then the Puerto Ricans.
And a lot of that was a strong tie to the working class, because I view the NYPD as a working, I see it.
Oh yeah,
and I see what was going on recently in New York with the Black Lives Matter riots. I would see the Black Lives Matter riots and the the men in the forest, and I have more in common with those men because a lot of them look like me, etc.
I always make that joke.
Right.
If you call the cops, bro, like 50-50, you're gonna get like Officer Rodriguez, Hernandez.
And it used to be you get Officer Costello and Officer Luciani show up a generation ago.
Same thing with the military, bro. Like that's also what Puerto Rico is like. Puerto Ricans have done a lot for America, so a lot of Puerto Ricans are pick-me's because they feel like America's gonna get them back for all they did. Especially if you look at the service in World War II and all that.
The Korean War, the Boricaneros.
Yup.
I mean, I want to ask, after the war, say World War II, Vietnam, did the Puerto Ricans have like access to the GI Bill to become, let's say, quote unquote, like American, now living in the in the suburb with the white picket fence, or were they excluded from that?
My understanding, if a Puerto Rican could pass for white, he was okay. If he was dark skinned, he couldn't get the GI Bill. That's what I've heard.
Got it.
Hey, you know what's funny? Like growing up in Long Island, this was like the first suburb, and there's like old Puerto Rican families though here too on Long Island.
Yeah, in Brentwood, a lot of Puerto Ricans out in Brentwood.
Sadly, Brentwood ain't Puerto Rican no more.
But are those Puerto Rican? Are they New Yorican?
So a couple of things I wanted to bring up about the 65th Infantry, which was the Puerto Rican battalion in Korea. They made them take off their shirts and they split them into white and black regiments under the 65th still, but they split them up. And I think that is probably almost how you answer the question. A New Yorican is an ex-Puerto Rican that has chosen to be culturally black or culturally white, but nonetheless gringo.
That's profound. That's true.
You know what also I noticed though is like here in New York, you see a lot of Puerto Rican Italian kids, Puerto Rican Irish kids, and like they'll be like 15% Puerto Rican. They'll be like, nah, I'm Puerto Rican. Like that's also an interesting dynamic. Like I know a lot of kids with like only like 15% Hispanic, but to them, that's like they're really proud of that.
That's everything that's always what fascinates me about these Hispanic and quote unquote white American mixes. The kids are always proud of that Hispanic heritage. Like my grandfather was from Spain, or my grandfather was Mexican, or my grandmother was Cuban. Like they just like this pride they have. It's something that I've always noticed.
I have a friend that has a kid, and he's like only like 10% Puerto Rican, but like his abuelita told him he was Spanish. He comes home, he's like, "Oh, do you guys know I'm Spanish?" He's like, "I'm just like you, Angelo." He's like, "Yo soy Boricuan."
Inquisidor, tell me more about. Are you New Yorican, or you don't get accepted as New Yorican because you're like a recent immigrant? Can you explain a little, or can you expand on that dynamic?
Yeah, sure. So the New Yorkers, they accept me, of course, but they definitely know I'm from the island.
How do they? How can they tell?
It's just by the Spanish.
Because you go to church or what?
Bueno, not so much because of that, but I would say the first indicator is they could just hear it. They could just hear that my Spanish has no, I mean, even though we do use English words like parking, like parqueate el carro, or me voy a comer un hot dog, or un hamburger instead of hamburguesa, we do have those English words that have permeated the island. But my Spanish is how can I put it to you? It's like the Spanish that you would hear from I don't even want to use these characters, but just for sake of popularity, but that maybe Daddy Yankee speaks. Like you could just hear like, okay, that this guy is from the island. He is not raised in New York, like, or in the United States. You could hear it. So that's the first that's the you know, the where they would know. They would know, okay, no, you're from the island.
And that's probably the biggest indicator, you would say, right? Que ya se dan cuenta, by the way you speak Spanish.
Yeah, the way you speak Spanish, and then also, it's a little bit tough because now with the rise of reggaeton and its popularity, and trap and all that stuff, we've been getting kind of like that like that ghetto influence. But even that is different. Even that, you can still like tell like the hood ghetto culture from Puerto Rico and the one from over here. But more importantly, at least you don't have to go that far back to where a Puerto Rican from the island is not doing that. He's probably wearing a polo shirt or a button-up shirt with khakis and some loafers or something like that, or some jeans, and he's not like wearing these gaudy like jewelry pieces that go down to your belly button. Not wearing fitted caps, like that kind of sort of thing,
Right. And it's that with the music, to touch on Dominicans, it's the same thing. You can tell by a Dominican barbershop if they were like recent Dominicans because they played dembow and the trap stuff, or if it's like Dominicans that have been here for a while. You look at the bodeguero, they're playing bachata and something more refined, I guess is what I would call it. I don't know. Because they see the dembow as like tigaraje and stuff like that. You know what I'm saying?
Right. Yeah.
Right.
So what's happening with the New Yorkers who moved to Orlando? Like, are they mixing in with other Hispanos, or like where do the New Yorkers go? I'm just trying to
they're starting to, but ironically, what's funny is from what I've always noticed about New Yorkers, they tend to get along better with white Catholics from the North, but they're starting now to get along with because they're the same people. It's just, the culture changed because they went to New York, but basically they're integrating with the other Puerto Ricans. But some of them get along with the white Catholics more. Some of them get along with the Puerto Ricans from the island more. So it's like not a 1-for-1 thing, if that makes sense. It's a case-by-case situation.
Yeah, I could tell you, and Alex, maybe you could expand this because you're actually, down in Central Florida. But it used to be that Puerto Ricans, I mean, at the very beginning, the only way you could get in here was through Ellis Island, which was at the very, very beginning. But so that's why you see such a huge Puerto Rican population in New York. And I'm talking about early, like the 20s, the 30s, the 40s, where if you spoke Spanish in New York, you were Puerto Rican. There was no other game in town. Like that was it. But then I would say probably sometime around the early 90s, mid 90s, from there on out, anybody leaving the island would go to Orlando. They would no longer come to New York. So right. I think that's why you see a more raw Puerto Rican population, meaning from the island in Orlando. And then the New Yorkers, I guess they're coming down now, and they're bumping in with I don't want to say the real Puerto Ricans, but you know what I mean.
Yeah. I want to add on to about that because the price of real estate in New York, now that it's ridiculously expensive, a lot of the Puerto Ricans that have been established in those neighborhoods for so long, they don't sell, and they you go to Brooklyn, you go uptown in New York. They don't, and then when they do want to move out, I think a lot of it has to do with the expense. I can find relatives in Orlando, and it's more affordable, and I still have a community there, very vaguely, but it's still there in Orlando. So tú sabes, ellos se lo encuentran más cómodo. Like a lot of New Yorkers, snowbirds is what we call them, right? They move south because the weather and it's cheaper.
Well, you know what's funny too is that the Puerto Ricans from the island that did move to Orlando, they got along with the Cubanos, the Dominicans, the Brazilians, and the Venezuelans. Like they tended, from what I observed, they tend to hang out more with that crew.
Yeah, like where I'm from, like the Dominicans and the Puerto Ricans hang out, and I hung out with them. They were Cuban, and like I was Cuban, and like then we recently started getting like El Salvadorian immigrants and all that, but they were just mixing pretty well too.
Right. Yeah, that's the
Like,
pattern.
just each other's balls. Like when we were younger, we would call them like the fucking desert Indians, like the Mexican kids and shit. But that's because like we was fucking around with each other.
I mean, in New York, what was the word? Los Mojaditos. I don't know if other groups use that. They would call Dominicans that.
Mojaditos.
A mojadito, yeah, if you without papers.
Right, because there used to be until the Dominican Republic got its economic house in order. Up until the 90s, there used to be a lot of illegal Dominicans going to Puerto Rico por la mona, por la mona.
That's right. That's the rite of passage for Dominican and Haitians to go through La Mona, get citizens in Puerto Rico, and then migrate here, right?
Yeah, it's funny you should mention that because I have a lot of Puerto Rican friends who their parents were Dominican, but they were born in Puerto Rico and they're Puerto Rican. End of story. It's their parents that are Dominican. So yeah, that's interesting. I know a lot of them
Cubans in Puerto Rico too.
Yeah, absolutely. My mom's side Cuban. But yeah, that's just funny how we're, it just goes to show that we are the same people at the end of the day, right? Because you cross the Mona Passage, you arrive in Puerto Rico, and you're Dominican. But guess what? Your kid's now Puerto Rican because he's gonna speak just like us. He's gonna do everything we do. He's gonna look like us. It's like
a perfect example. Jorge Posada. He's from Puerto Rico, but I think his parents were Cuban.
Well, yeah. Look at that. Yeah, many cases.
Yeah. Let me address this point that Luis Gonzalez brought up. Because he was kind of talking for a while. I was trying to keep up with him. He keeps kind of going on that the Spanish are white. And, these definitions, again, are they're very arbitrary. And ultimately, the way that I explain it is that white is an Anglo copyright, right? The Anglos copyrighted that term and they own that term. So let me pull up this map here. If you guys can see the screen. You see here is the pre-Islam heartland of Europe. So when you talk about Europe to a ancient Greek or an ancient Roman, they didn't consider Scandinavia or the North Sea or the Baltic Sea Europe. Europe essentially was everything around the Mediterranean, right? Especially, from the Adriatic Sea down to modern day Spain. So, all the civilizations along this coast would have been seen as European, and all the people in civilizations, north of the Rhine or the Danube would not be. So when we're talking about white, we're talking about it in a modern Anglo-American context, and officially by the U.S. Census, Spaniards are not considered white. Now that's laughable because but yet people from like Somalia are. Right. So it shows you how laughable this whole racial identity is. Again, white has historically in this country operated as an Anglo copyright. And it's like a identity that they let people have when they need people to do something for them. So, it's no Irish, no dogs, but we need the Irish to beat up the blacks in New York City. So we're going to give them the white card. Right. And so you're kind of seeing the same dynamic, or WAPs, right? Italians without papers, right? They weren't necessarily considered white. At best, they're kind of like an associate white, you know, they're really kind of more Arabs, or they're kind of more Middle Eastern, the same thing that they say about Spanish and Greek people, by the way. So again, white is an Anglo term. So no, the Spaniards are not white. The American government doesn't consider them white. It considers them Spanish or Hispano. So the American government really kind of makes it easy for us because they're telling us how they see us. They don't care if you're light skinned and green eyed, you're still a Mexican to them, right? And so now you're asking, what's wrong with being a white Hispanic? Nothing. What you're doing is you're adding racial categories to an ethnic identity, right? Hispano is an ethnic identity. That is not necessarily a race in the American sense, right? In the American sense, race is black, white, yellow. It's like skin color. Traditionally, race would be more like Slavic would be a race, right? You have many different kinds of Slavic ethnicities, right? Even the kind of the Anglo-Germanic people who were into kind of race theories and stuff, they would classify the Mediterranean race as different from like whatever they called themselves, Alpine or whatever the fuck. You know, they would identify 3 or 4 different races in Europe. So saying that you're
Teutonic.
Yeah, Teutonic, that was the other one. Saying that you're a white Hispanic is not the way to do it, because it's like you're not Afro-Latino, you're not Afro-Hispano, you're Hispano, right? We don't put hyphens in our identity like gringos do, right? Where you're like, I'm an Italian American or I'm an African American. No, you're just an Hispano, right? If you're from Mexico, you're just a Mexican, right? You're not a white Mexican, a black Mexican, or whatever the hell. You're just Mexican. If you're Cuban, you're Cuban. It's same thing. If you're Hispano, you're Hispano. Skin color, race is not a category that is very relevant in Hispanoamerica. It never was historically, even before Spain was something. To the Romans, it also never was something important. They proactively mixed with the people they conquered, and that's how they Romanized these people, right? The Gauls, the Iberians, the people in the Romanians, all these people were Romanized. So
yeah, it's not a category of reality, as a good doctor would say, right?
Yeah,
Spaniards are Mediterranean in the story.
Yeah, Luis, I would agree with your statement here. That's exactly right. We should respect our Spanish root, and we're not going to respect them if we call them white. Right?
Rancho, if you're able to pull up the 2020 census ballot, so we can put this to rest. But, I remember, I filled out the census this year, and I remember one of the first questions being, are you, Hispano by ethnicity? Yes and no, and then it goes into race. And if I'm not mistaken, throughout the years, like the census, obviously they have changed, and that's, whether they opened it up or closed it on what their definitions are. I mean, I don't even think the government has any clue what they're asking when they send us these forms. But I'm just saying, like,
Yeah, exactly. I mean, they make it easy for us. If you guys look at the episode that we did, a WASP take on Hispanos, it's a 2-part episode that we did where we're covering Huntington's. Basically, he talked about the Hispano question, the Hispano problem from an Anglo perspective.
And from the Anglo perspective, what I find interesting about the census and the College Board application is now that, they see Hispano, now they want to say, oh, are you Hispano? And then Mexican, Cuban, Chicano, all these things, Puerto Rican. And then everyone else is something else. But this is just like the Anglo not knowing how to ask these questions, or not even having any idea about what they're asking us. You know what I'm saying? So, yeah.
Well, you know what's it's funny about that Huntington article, which came out in 2004. Right after that article, that's when the whole anti-Hispanic thing started with immigration, because before that, it was like nobody really cared about immigration. Then all of a sudden, he made this big fuss And before you know it, oh, we're being invaded by Mexico. You know, that's when it all began in a lot of ways.
You know, and that was 2004. The Huntington article was from, right?
Yeah.
Right. So in 2014, the New York Times released an article saying there's now a thing where there's a thing, quote unquote, white Hispanic. More Hispanics are identifying with this, and I think the New York Times pulled this up from the 2010 census. But it's just like so myopic because they're not even gauging it correctly. And at times, I guess it can be divisive because now we're answering these questions, and now, like, you know, mainstream media wants to conduct exit polls differently when they look at the election, such as Florida, right? So it's like I don't even know if they know what they're doing. I don't think they know what they're doing.
Yeah, I mean, all that matters to them is whether you're a beaner or you're not. And a beaner we don't care about your eye color. We don't care about your skin color. You know, that's really what it comes down to. And so I want to just, you know, wrap up with Luis here, that we should respect our Spanish roots. There are people, they are not monsters. And yeah, that's essentially what we talk about here. So one of the big things is that is dispelling the black legend, right? Understanding that the black legend came from our historical enemies who are still waging kinetic, psychological, and cultural war against us. You know, we shouldn't think that because the Spanish Empire died and we have these 20-something countries that came out of it, including modern Spain, that our enemies don't longer see us as a united entity that they have to subdue. And one of the interesting things about this present moment is really our demographic power, right? If you include Brazil, you know, there's 700 million Hispanos, and the median age is in his 20s. Now, contrast the 700 million Hispanos with an average age of 20 to the Anglos in the United States, and include Canada, let them have Canada. You're talking about, you know, at most 200 million, but realistically it's more about 175, even 150 million, whose median age is in their 50s. So for every one, you know, Jeff Johnson who's in his 50s, there's 4, you know, Marquez brothers who are in their 20s. And so we have to stop letting our eyes be guided by Anglo worldviews and dialectics, which racialize everything. And we need to kind of like let loose and see, like, really what is it that unites us? And that's our ethnic identity. And that's really what I've presented, right? Raza Unido said, like, you know, why don't I embrace our, you know, Montezuma? And it's like, no, I totally do. It's just, you have to understand that things are placed in the right order, you know, to the microcosm that is a family. The family is the basic building block of society. Anglos will tell you it's the individual, but no one's born an individual, right? You don't have language as an individual. You don't have customs and traditions as an individual. That's the problem with, quote unquote, the white world.
And even right, and I want to add, like, even what we know as the Protestant work ethic, you know, look at the Hispanic work ethic that we're cultivating in this country, right. with our medium age. Shit, I mean, they might even change the language for that soon. So, like, let's not, you know, fall blind to, you know, the changes that they throw at us, so that the dialectic, you know, doesn't go in our favor. You know what I'm saying? So there's that to take into account.
Can I address something? This guy, Alex Gomez, just wrote, if we're going to embrace our European heritage, I'd emphasize the Roman legacy over the Spanish. It's the same legacy. The Spanish Empire was an offshoot of the Roman Empire. And a lot of people need to grasp that. This is why, even to this day, the modern flag of Spain is red and gold. That is the colors of the Roman Empire. The king of Spain viewed himself as a Roman emperor. The Spanish tercios were carbon copies of the Roman legion. These are not coincidences. So embracing our Spanish heritage is our Roman heritage, because the way it works is Spanish is our the Spaniards are our paternal heritage. The Romans are our grandparents. It's the same family.
So, yeah, you know, and again, let's bring it back into the microcosm that is the family unit. And this is really where it all matters, because if our basic building block, our basic unit, the family, is well built and well organized, then when you have a family of families, you're able to build these exponential effects that, you know, you're not going to be able to plan or invent in a classroom or on an essay. It's just creating the right environment. When there's many well-ordered families, you get, you know, culture and civilization come from that. And so that's why I like to connect our micro with our macro. Let me pause right here and explain something. Spain, the country today, the Spain in the Iberian Peninsula, is not our paternal root. The Spanish Empire was our paternal root. Spain is not the Spanish Empire. Spain is as much a child of the Spanish Empire as Mexico, Cuba, Nicaragua, Colombia. It's just another piece of that empire that once was. They're not our paternal root. They're brothers, right? Through our father, through our paternal root, but they're not our paternal root in itself. You can look at it like, let's say dad, you know, your dad was married and he had a family with his like wife that like his mom forced on him, and like, you know, he's like the wimpy kid, but he's like the official kid. But yet dad's favorite kid was the one that he had with the India back in Mexico, right? That was Martin, right? He was the alpha. He was the badass, right? And we'll go into Martin Cortez on another episode. But it's like, this is a more relevant example. Schwarzenegger, right? Schwarzenegger had his kids with the Kennedy girl or whatever, Shriver, whatever the name is. But he had the kid with his Guatemalan lady, and the kid with the Guatemalan lady is like the ultimate Chad, right? He's the mestizo, and he's like handsome, and he takes on more of his dad. Whereas the kid from the official wedding is like this chubby wimp. And so that's an apt way of understanding it. So again, emphasizing the Spanish paternal root is not emphasizing Spain as we know it today. No, that's our weird white brother, if you want to call it that way. It's not so much about even the Spanish Empire itself. It's kind of like what we just explained to Alex, was the Spanish Empire itself was an iteration of the Roman Empire. It's where Romanitas found a home after Western Rome fell, right? And Romanitas est Hispanitas, right? Hispanitas is Romanitas. And that also then went over to us. And today, the Hispano spirit, that Roman spirit, Hispanitas, lives way stronger in the Americas than it does in Spain. And I would say damn near half of the Spaniards I've ever met in my life would admit and say the exact same thing. They're like, no, we went the wrong way. And, you know, we became French, and you guys are the ones who really kept the family legacy going. But again, the point is to bring it into the micro so that now we as young men in our 20s, right? 20s or 30s, you know, I'm 32. When we're forming families, if we understand the proper order of a family, the proper structure of a family, you know, God over man, men over women, women over children, then everything is going to happen as a consequence of things naturally. We don't have to worry so much about what schemes we're going to come up with. Let's just worry about producing good families, because the effect of that is a nuclear explosion that nobody's going to be able to sustain or handle. Does that make sense?
That makes perfect sense. That makes perfect sense.
Right. I mean, all of that encapsulates where we are here today, and that makes perfect sense. Yes.
We have to make right by ourselves first before we ever even think of contemplating, this grand reunification scheme. Basically, we need to we have to raise our family rights, get right with God, and then the pieces will fall into place.
Right, because our biggest challenge is us being here, and what is thrown at us for us being here. But Rancho, you translated the past into where we are present day.
Right.
Yes.
That's a super important point. because I think sometimes that half is missed, and people promote, oh, you know, be plentiful, have a big family, have a big family. And yes, it's true. You should have a big family. But if you don't form them right, they're just going to be drafted. So you're just, you know,
you're just going to give your children up to jam culture, and that's the end of it.
Exactly.
Yeah, one of your kids might come out like Martinez Taino, the other one might come out like that Puerto Rican white race warrior.
Yeah, and that's exactly what's happening, because you do not have the proper understanding of man and his maker and his father in heaven, right? You don't understand the role of a father in the family. You know, these are houses that are going to probably overwhelmingly led by women on the Latinx side. And then on the pick-me side, I think, is men who lack a certain virility or vigor in life, who feel like they're not going to be able to win without Anglos on their side. But again, there's 700 million of us. We don't suffer from the Anglo neurosis, historical hangups, anal retentiveness. You know, we have brothers, you know, there's 4 of us, again, to every one of them. We are the 3rd biggest ethnic group in the world. We should begin to see ourselves as that. We are a significant civilization. We have been historically, okay? The problem is that when you use white as an identity, now English, now Croats or Pole Americans can now claim the accomplishments of your Spanish ancestors, right? Because, oh, the Spanish are white. Oh, they're only white when they make us look cool. You know, that's basically what the Anglos do. But they're not really white. But we're not going to let you, hybrid boy, claim your heritage. You know, you're just a rape baby. That's ultimately where they cope out in. Yet most of us who are mixed, who do have significant Spanish blood, that Spanish blood doesn't even come during the conquest. It doesn't even come during the empire. Most Spanish immigration to the Americas happened after independence. So chances are you come from a Spanish peasant who just married the Indian girl down the street, dude. I mean, that's what it comes down to.
Right, and let's not forget who also, like, we've assimilated throughout history in our culture. You know, there was Arabs, Lebanese that went into Venezuela and all these countries, Japanese, Peruvian, and all of that integrated into that. So yeah, it's not only Spanish, but there was a lot of, you know, that went on.
Yeah. So if everyone feels good here, I want to transition back to kind of where I really was trying to take the conversation. Let's bring it back to Cuba a bit here. And again, before I transition into this, I want to show this part, since we're kind of talking about New Spain. You know, Alex brought up the point that New Spain was more important than Spain itself. Yes, it was. It was the de facto center of the empire. And it was a tremendous shame that we lost that prominence, because New Spain was the capital of the other viceroyalties, right? It was the Rome. The Rome in the New World was Mexico City. And the Roman Empire got so big at one point that they had to split it up. And they had, you know, minor civil wars amongst themselves, but they didn't have these brutal, traumatic wars of independence that then had to force a fake narrative and a fake myth in order to make the nation work, where it never really worked. And all you really did was, you know, break the empire up and then make yourself, you know, throw yourself under the Anglo yoke. You know, that never happened in Rome. So the empire could have broken up in a different way. And I think, you know, to think that what we're looking up here on the map, New Spain would still largely be what you see here. I mean, this would all be New Spain probably till about the southern border of Costa Rica. Cuba would be New Spain. Florida would be New Spain. Texas would be New Spain. And what you need to realize, especially if you're a Mexican nationalist, is that there's no way Mexico is ever going to be militarily protected from the United States if it doesn't control entry into the Gulf, right? And obviously it would need to have control over Cuba to be able to kind of cordon this off and not let any boats attack its heartland, which is right here. So Mexico is just like a guy with his arms up, just having his belly wide open for a kill shot. And so long as that's the case, you can never expect Mexico to develop. So what you're seeing is that the future of Mexico intrinsically is tied to southern Florida and Cuba and Texas in the Gulf, and all our brothers from Mississippi and Alabama, which we can touch about another episode. Maybe they should get their own little country here as long as they don't build military ships, and maybe we can help them do that. We'll leave that for another episode. But the point is, this needs to be blocked off and protected. And the beauty, and now we're going to transition into Cuba and Fidel Castro, and how to properly understand the kind of commie legends from Hispanoamerica, how to properly understand someone like a Castro or like a Che Guevara, which a lot of people have kind of asked that I touch on this subject. So I'll give my take on it, and then I'll open it up to you guys. I think the right way to understand phenomenons like Che and Fidel is to understand them not as commies, but to understand them as ethno-nationalists who simply had to adopt communist rhetoric because they were a product of their time, right? That generation was embroiled in the Cold War. And if you wanted to fight against, American imperialism in Hispanoamerica, then essentially the only people willing to throw bullets at you to make that happen was the Soviet Union. And if you see with Castro, when he first kind of mounted his revolution and took over Cuba, he wasn't a communist. He kind of became a communist because essentially he had to. So again, you have to view these men as ethno-nationalists. You can't get caught up in the rhetoric, saying that they're communists or left. They're extremely right wing. This is as close to National Socialism as in Hispanoamerica as you will find in Cuba. So that's the proper way to understand these men. And one of the things that you see that Castro did, whether he did it intentionally or not, is that he essentially colonized southern Florida, right? On behalf of Team Hispano, by sending a bunch of Cuban elites and then, other Cubans into southern Florida. He's essentially made it a colony of Hispanoamerica. And today, de facto, Miami is our New York City, right? It is the Hispano New York City. Miami, though it is politically, governmentally part of the United States, it doesn't really serve the United States. It serves Latin America. So the elite from Colombia hop on a 2-hour plane ride to Miami. The ones from Nicaragua hop on an hour and a half. Mexico City, they all meet there, right? Miami is where the elites from our country all meet. It's not like LA where it's just like mostly working class or peasant class immigration. You get elite immigration, you get upper class immigration. And so the dynamic in Miami is much more authentic, I think, to what you would really see as a city of Hispanoamerica than you would in LA, even though LA has a lot of Hispanics, like 50-60%. But again, they are not politically dominant, right? They don't assert themselves like they do in Miami. So what you see there is that because of this, it gives Mexico, it's kind of like it's its left hand where it can kind of block a punch coming towards it. So, okay, I'll leave it there. Go ahead. Who wants to come in? Angelo, baby?
Yeah, like the thing is, people need to realize is that the world isn't black and white. Like, not everything is so simple. Like Che Guevara and all them siding with the communists is just because who else are you gonna get weapons from? Like, I forget, there was a dude in Africa, I think it was Liberia, and he was like, I don't care who sends me the weapons. He's like, if the Pentagon has some, if the Soviet Union has some, I'll take them. Like these people, they had no other alternative, and it's economically left wing, but it's socially right. It's socially Hispanic. And I think the reason why this socialism has a pretty good working ethic in South America is because they're sharing it with their people, their brothers. There is no real racial divide like that.
Right. You want to talk about the history of Castro and his takeover?
So Castro's dad was rich, right? But Castro lived with his mom, who was a house cleaner, basically. So he was growing up with the black sugarcane workers, the white poor dude. And then it's funny, he went to, and then as he got older, his dad, he wasn't a bad kid, but he wasn't a good kid. He was just a Hispanic kid getting into fights, wanting to be a man. So his dad sent him to a Jesuit school, which is funny. You see a lot of communists that very religious parents or go through religion education. And for a while, he as being a lawyer, he protested Batista. He even tried to sue Batista, and that got him put on a list. Like I'm just like making it fast, the history. But his rise to power was through the people because they believed in him. He knew how to unite them. He's like black, white, the few Asian people we have here, Indians. You know, we're all Cubans. We're all struggling. We're all struggling against America. This isn't the reason why you're struggling. Isn't the white Spanish neighbor you have? It's America.
Right. But do you know what, like, essentially in the beginning, he was kind of more of a nationalist, right? An ethno-nationalist. And then he kind of adopted this communist rhetoric again, because he didn't really have a choice.
It's when he went to Mexico, he really got into it. And he also went to Colombia during a riot where he got more into communism.
Right. But even at the outset of the revolution in the beginning, he never declared himself a communist.
No, he was just for Cuba.
He looked to work with the Anglos and they kind of rejected him. And so then he said, well, fuck it. They're not working with me. So
because even his his, I guess you can call him his arch rival, Batista, him and Batista had a similar life. Fidel had like an admiration to him, but like to beat a man, you got to beat the man was his like thing with that.
Right. And
which is a very Hispanic worldview. He's like, all right, you got what I want. I'm willing to fight you for it.
Right.
And, let's not forget what was Havana in the 50s. Havana was, wealthier than Vegas, and they had more like casinos and all these things. It was the central like tourism site of the world, but the money wasn't circulating in the country. It was Batista back and forth with the mafia, and the United States had an involvement that didn't sit well with Castro.
Right. Yeah. And basically Cuba was like the Philippines or Thailand, where like these horny white dudes get to fuck little girls, if they pay enough. And
it was basically America's vacation spot.
Yeah, it was. And
like,
there was
they
a
would
lot
come and play baseball with us and all that shit, and like treat us like doo-doo.
There wouldn't be a Las Vegas if it wasn't because Havana closed down. So
right,
it just wouldn't be. Las Vegas would just be a desert, probably still.
Can you share with us a bit, because you're Cuban too, right?
Yeah. From my mother's side. Yep.
Yeah. How did your mom end up in Puerto Rico?
So my family actually left before the revolution. So that story, I'm afraid that it's not gonna be too good for the subject at hand. But basically, my grandfather, my maternal grandfather, he was a musician in a rather popular Cuban group called Conjunto Casino. And he played with a lot of big stars, Celia Cruz and others. And he came to play a gig, and he used to play in New Orleans, in Memphis, in Las Vegas. And then he came to New York, and he fell in love with New York. So he basically, told my grandmother, we're moving. I was like, what? What do you mean we're moving? We're moving to New York. It's this great city. You're gonna like it. You're gonna love it, whatever. So they come here to New York, to the very same exact apartment that I'm in right now. This was in 1953. And then, without getting too deep into it, they separate, and my grandfather moves to Puerto Rico. At which point, my mother, I think my grandmother was gonna send my mom to a boarding school in Spain, but she worked out a deal that if she could go to a Catholic school in Puerto Rico with her dad. And long story short, she went to Puerto Rico to live with her dad, my grandfather, and she met my father in Puerto Rico. So it was pre-revolution.
Got it.
Now I know my grandfather was a sympathizer
of who?
With Castro. I think, as most Cubans were, and the way that he the way I understood it in my family is that Castro was simply a nationalist.
Yeah.
He wanted Cubans to have self-determination. He felt like Cuba was being ran by the United States, and of course to the Cubans' disadvantage. And when you're facing off with the United States at that time, there's only one other place to go. You know, what was he going to do? You know, like appeal to, who do you appeal to? The only other juggernaut out there was the USSR. So you hear stories at the beginning how when Castro came to power, he got a good deal getting oil from the Soviets.
Right.
And he asked the United States, you know, I need to work out a deal because Texaco owns the refinery here.
Right.
And so, you know, we need to get this oil refined. And the United States didn't want to do it at all. It's not like give the United States a sweet deal or Texaco a sweet deal and let's do it. They did not want to do it. So he said, you know what? Nationalized. And that kept happening. You know, he kept working. Oh, you're not going to do it? Nationalized. And, you know, you can look at it that he fell into the lap of the Soviets or that the Soviets kind of egged him on. But the way I understand it is there was only one other game in town. If you were going to go face to face with the United States, you needed Soviet help.
Yeah.
And, you know, I think that's a good beginning to at least how I understand things on my side of the family, that he was just a nationalist who was heading up against the United States. And the only choice, the only people that could help you was the Soviet Union.
Right. And I think one of the things to note is that Castro came from money, right? But you know,
he didn't at the same time.
Well, his dad had money, and
like he came into his dad's money when he was 15. So his early childhood was spent with farmers.
Yeah, and that's the thing to note, that even though he came from money, he was a humble kid. He never thought his money made him of a higher order than these other people. So he had a very egalitarian outlook of Cubans, no matter what race or social class. He saw himself as like a steward, because his dad was kind of like a shot caller in his region, and his dad was known to give people jobs even though he didn't need those jobs performed by those people. So like, you know, he would basically eat at his profit margin to give local people work, and they kind of saw him as like a local godfather type of character. And so you know, when Castro took everybody's land and started splitting it up amongst people, he did the same with his father's land, right? Which I think is interesting. Is like, you know, his brother, I think somebody kept a very small portion of what they owned because there wasn't enough land to hand out to people. And so, you know, everybody got their land nationalized. Now, I don't know the details ins and outs.
Yeah. And I want to say, speaking about Castro's early life and his father and his relationship with his father was really crucial into making him, you know, Castro's spirit as we know today. You know, Castro, his father was a wealthy rancher that had employed, you know, Haitian migrants, and Castro was very keen on telling them, I'm not into the bourgeoisie stuff. Like, this is why my dad has me here working in the field with you. And it was ingrained in him very young because of the work ethic that we ought not to forget that a lot of us have, and it's in us. And Castro carried that throughout his life, even, you know, despite being a lawyer, and you could say this and that, but it was ingrained in him what work was and who was working, you know, right along with him, that his father hired, right? Because it wasn't like, you know, they kept all the Cubans of different makeup out. Everyone was involved, and Castro was exposed to this.
Hello.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, yeah. So what's going on, everybody? I'm a Pingu on Twitter, the Hispanic Penguin, the Miami Cuban. So I want to give you guys a little perspective. Yeah, que hola, what's going on? Que vuelta.
Que hola, Cere.
Ahí en la lucha. Bro, so I'll give you guys a perspective from so my family came from the Marielito boatlift, the Mariel boatlift. Now I'm not super historically well read like you guys are, so I can only tell you guys from my, from what I understand.
Yeah.
But it's gonna be a tough sell to get people, that I know in Miami and things like that, to get this Hispanic, pro Hispano Fidel and Che view, because, well, for example, I have people in my family that got killed by Che,
Yeah.
so that's a reality of what happened. Now, if how we're gonna give this pan-Hispanism to it, I mean, look, I can say, Castro did badass things. There's no question about that. Now, was everything rose-colored glasses and all that? I don't know. It's hard to paint it that way because he come. I don't know. I don't know enough of historically enough. I have to look more into it, but that's just, I don't know. I have my 2 cents here.
Yeah, yeah.
No, I Bingo, I understand exactly what you're saying. And I think we're just discussing it, to get a better idea with it, but I don't think it's going to be our marketing, our opener, I understand exactly what you're talking about.
I think it's just that Fidel and Che are the most successful characters we have right now.
Yeah.
In the modern era. Like, Fidel literally personifies being a Hispanic man. This dude played basketball. He was balling up on niggas. He was playing baseball. He was sleeping with CIA agents that were supposed to kill him. Like, he was just balling on America.
No. I can agree on that. Like, I have pinta, like he did what he wanted. But...
Like, I come from a pro Castro family and all that, so like, we just have that different like view.
I would ask why would they leave, but that's for a different day.
Well, my dad left because he was just ambitious. Like, he's like, I had no problem with Cuba. He's just like, I just wanted to see America.
A capitalist, you say?
That's the thing I know. I mean, my family's married with a sizable amount of Cubans, and the joke is that, like, Cubans are going to say what they need to say in order to get their papers, but next summer they're in Cuba. They went to TJ first, to fly out, and then they're in Cuba, living it up. But they'll tell you that they're being persecuted because it's just kind of what you need to say in order to get those papers rolling.
Like, I heard an interesting dynamic from my great grandmother. She's black, and she said, like, when Castro came to power, the black people of Cuba celebrated. And my grandma told me a story. The only time she was like ever heard the word niggers when like the American tourists would come and just refer to her as that. She's like, no Cuban ever called me a nigger.
Right.
Muhammad Ali echoed the same sentiment about Vietnam. no Viet Cong called me a nigger.
Right, exactly.
No, there's no racism in Cuba like that.
But yeah, so
there isn't. Like, people have Black Mary in their house with white baby Jesus.
I mean, and again, I'm not a communist. I'm just highlighting, the work ethic and spirit and some would say it was a complex relationship that Che and Castro had. But I want to read something to y'all that really caught my eye about Che's last letter he sent to Cuba in 1965 to Castro. It goes, quote, "I have always identified with the foreign policy of our revolution, and I will continue to be wherever I am." He ends up going to Bolivia next. "I will always feel the responsibility of the Cuban Revolution, and I shall behave as such. I'm not sorry that I leave nothing material to my wife and children. I am happy it is this way. I ask for nothing, and as the state will provide for them with enough to live on and receive an education." So it's just like this, end quote. So it's just like this really like simplistic thing of like so let's put ourselves in the 1960s and what was happening in all of our countries and all these things, right? It's just addressing, the spirit and work ethic to find a better place, whether you think it's, good or bad, but that's, something I just find really valuable to me. So.
I have a couple of chess stories too. One is personal, from my family. I'll save that one for last. But I heard it been said that he visiting the Soviet Union. He was in Moscow, and he's having dinner with the Nikita Kreshnev and those guys. And he looks around and he looks at the silverware and the food and whatnot, and he looks at Nikita Khrushchev and he says, "Is this how the Russian proletariat eat?" That was I thought that was kind of like pretty interesting that he would be in the Soviet Union, look him in the eye and ask him that question: "Is this how the proletariat eat?"
Can anyone here speak to the differences that Che and Castro had? Because I've heard growing up that there were slight differences between them. A Guevaranist and a Castro's Cuba was slightly different in a sense.
Let me say this second one real quick. The other one is actually from my second cousin, my mother's cousin, she came to the U.S. after the revolution, and she was actually working in a factory that Che visited. And she said that Che was the first one to start working, the last one to stop, and that he would not eat till everybody else had eaten. That's it. That's all I got for you. But, you see that and it's like, wow, this guy, whether you disagree with him or not, he's the real deal,
Yeah. Let me address this real quick that DC brought up, that communism is heretical. Yeah, none of us are communists. None of us are necessarily promoting communism. I've never read Marxist theory, but from what I know about Marx, I'm not interested. Though I do understand the appeal of kind of protecting workers and working class, but I think you actually find that in actual church teaching and tradition, all that stuff is lined out. And if you look at things like the 8-hour workday, for example, it came from Spanish law in the Americas, specifically in dealing with Indians. So I think there's a church tradition that actually preserves the rights of workers better. I just don't think it's never necessarily been employed. But again, I think the way to view these people is kind of what Angela had said earlier, is that over the last 200 years, when we broke the empire apart, essentially all we've done is just been served up L's on the world stage, right? It's just L after L after L, losing resources, losing land, losing people. Till this day, it's still operating much in that way. So when you see somebody like a Fidel or a Che, or even somebody as controversial as like Escobar, it's like the closest thing to a dub we've been able to put up on the board. And yes, it's not ideal, but there's still these men, whether you hate them personally, you still have to respect them for being able to capture an essence of that hispanidad, that boldness, that bravery, that, putting your money where your mouth is, that man of action, that, that ranchero kind of spirit. And that's how to view these people. At least that's how I'm presenting it. Right. Yeah.
Castro wasn't even Cuban. I mean, Castro wasn't even communist. He just ended up being communist at the end, just out of like necessity, really.
Yeah,
he really just was anti-Yankee. Was the whole revolution. Like,
right.
They were just up in the mountains, just shouting out anti-Yankee shit the whole time.
Right.
Like if he was like, because even then, like communism is confusing because then it breaks up. Like Lenin and them were like and Trotsky, they were just like douchebags. And can you consider Joseph Stalin a communist? Like I don't. I consider him like a Che Guevara person, like the hardest man on the block.
Yeah, exactly.
DC. No, sorry, Rancho. No, because DC, what he said is true. It's true. I think all of us here are Catholic or Orthodox. We're Christian men, and we understand communism, like Freemasonry, is a no-no. So, we're just discussing history. So relax, okay? DC, tranquilito.
Yeah.
No, the expert, the letter I read was just addresses like spirit, when it came to combating. But it wasn't me advocating for communism. It was just like putting, I wanted to put us in that time frame just to like, see where they were at.
You asked that question, Angelo. I want to punt the question back to you. You know more about Marxist theory, or kind of more working class activism. How do modern commies view figures like Che or Fidel?
They view him as a red fascist or a violent leader, but at the end of the day, like these people are just so ridiculous. They think the world is sunshine and rainbows, and that these people that take action are like evil and red fascists, quote unquote. Like, if I took all the Western communists that live in America and I sent them to go hang out with like some Southern Mexican separatists or like FARC, like these people would be beaten, stripped naked, and probably shot. It just goes to that like Anglo like worldview. It's not like Russian like communism, because the Russian people, they we bring Russia up a lot because they have a lot in common with us. It's weird how that works. Because Russia knows how to like fight and stand up, but the thing is with these Western communists is they really do believe in the process. Like they can win democratic elections and shit. Like they are revolutionaries, quote unquote, that work in the system. And when it comes time for action, they're not going to be there. Like you see,
so they don't like Fidel and Che because they're Mexican, basically.
No, also because they're real men. Like like you think. If a woman came up to Fidel, it's like, you don't stand for women's rights. You're a fucking second. He would slap the shit out that bitch.
Right.
He'd be like, bitch.
The point I'm trying to drive is that, again, Marxist theorists don't even accept Che and Fidel. They don't necessarily see them as communists. Again, I think the right way to understand this phenomenon, it's, again, just dispassionately, right? Not personal. I'm not trying to connect myself personally to these people. But just from, 100-mile view, you see how these men, in a sense, presented Hispanidad to the world. And these men are respected around the world, right? You'll go to Serbia, you're going to see portraits of Che on walls. The world sees us through these men, right? So even, again, I had mentioned somebody like Escobar, who, again, was a bandido, a coke dealer. But he did develop like a folk hero-ness to him, a symbolicness to them. And that's kind of what Che and Fidel have become, regardless, divorced completely from their actions or their political or economic views, but more, again, symbols of a sense of like ethno-nationalism, Hispanos being an ethnicity.
So I have a question for you guys. In respect to Cuba, what would you think as like the U.S. government policy towards Cuba should be? Like, you think we should be completely hands off and let them do what they should, whatever, or how should we go about that? As like,
I don't think you
like
want
from
US
here in the U.S.
Yeah, I don't think you want U.S. involvement in your country, man. The U.S. involvement.
No, I would agree. I agree. No, I agree.
So,
but I mean, more so like, should we even like bother? I don't know. I mean, as us, as me here in Miami.
Yeah. I mean, I think what I would recommend, and I recommend this to all pochos, right, in the U.S., is you have family, some distant relative back home, find ties, go visit, go look at opportunities, go look at some land, go find out where that town is that, a third of the people there share your last name. They're probably distant relatives of you, and try to establish those independent, direct routes to your country, to the land. If you have friends from other countries, if you want to diversify, do the same. That's something that I've largely done myself.
Also, for Cuban Americans that feel they don't have any relatives left, Cuba has I don't know exactly what the program is, but Cuba really enjoys when Cuban Americans come to visit Cuba and learn and all that.
Yeah,
they see it like, okay, like if you guys want to know the true history, you're free to come back.
For me, I would say, I guess the biggest thing is the embargo, right?
Yeah, but you can always go through Canada too. Like that, it's mad easy.
Oh no, I'm not talking about like visiting. I'm talking about it. Pingu's question about what do we feel about Cuba? What should do and what
Cuba actively doesn't want to trade with the United States still.
Okay, great. But my point is the embargo is always like a big thing, ¿verdad?
Mm-hmm.
Number one, it doesn't work, right? If it was going to topple the Cuban government, it would have done it a long time ago. Number two, if it's hurting anybody, it's probably the same people that get hurt with sanctions in Iran and in other countries, right? It's like the most vulnerable. Number three, coño, yo quiero fumar unos tabacos cubanos, and I can't find any here in New York. So for me, the embargo is a no-go, and probably just be treated with. I mean, if we deal with China, right? So the gringos deal with China, que es 10,000 veces peor que Cuba. I think. I don't think Cuba forces you to have abortions, and
at this point, they leave the government there because they want to. Because if they really wanted to, they could have toppled the government over. They could have tried. At least at this point, after Castro died,
right?
That's the thing. I don't think the U.S.
Interesting.
That's why Castro needed the Soviet Union. If America was going to come into Cuba, the Soviet Union would be right there, and Cuba still keeps a good relationship with like the third world and all that, like with China, North Korea. So Cuba is like in a no man's land where it can't make moves, but it really can't have moves made against it.
Right. Hey, one thing I want to talk about a bit is how the Italian mafia ended up in Cuba, and there's a reason for this. The Italian mafia are Sicilians, correct? And as we all know, Sicily was part of Aragon in Spain for 600 years. The reason the Italians went down to Cuba is because the Italian mafia were anti-pygmies. They held on. You can knock the mafia all they want, but they're the real Italianos, okay? They held on to their heritage from Italy, from Sicily. So what happened was they saw a business opportunity in Cuba. And guess what? They felt at home in Cuba. Because being a Sicilian, you're going to be more home in Cuba than you are in New York. You know what I'm saying? So what happened is the U.S. government started to turn against Batista, okay? Because you know why? All those Italians that had FBI warrants and stuff were hiding out in Havana. So in a way, they didn't mind Castro overthrowing Batista. What they didn't expect was that Castro was not going to be their tool. And the reason Castro overthrew Batista was because the United States pulled the plug on Batista because he was not giving up those Italians. So that's a little aspect that's not mentioned sometimes.
I didn't know that. I know there's a lot of Sicilian Cubans in Florida.
I mean, Sicilians are honorary Hispanos. I mean, 600 years they were part of the Spanish Empire. They fought side by side with our ancestors.
Yeah, they're definitely cousins.
At the Battle of the Gargliano River, which was Gonzales de Cordoba, one of his most famous victories, were using the cover of a rainstorm in December. It's cold, okay, even in Italy. The first troops across the Gargliano River to slit the throat of the French were Sicilians.
Yeah, I know. I mean, obviously, we touched on it a little bit. I think we should devote an episode to kind of the Italian root within the Spanish root and how that manifested out here in the Americas. I know there's a guy who has a really good channel, Massa Man. He's done an episode of like Italian Latinos.
Oh, the genetics dude?
Yeah,
oh, he's great.
Yeah, he's really cool. He seems to like Hispanos a lot. He looks like he's Hispanic, but he's not.
He's German and like Iranian or some shit.
And black.
Yeah. On his white side.
But he looks.
We should try to get Lucian.
Yeah. I want to get him for that episode for sure.
That man just has the worst time zone.
I know. I want to touch a little bit on Castro as another final note here is that, again, if you look at any hero is another man's villain, right? Like if you go to Mexico and you go to the north for the people who fought with Villa, you're going to find some families there that said, oh, fuck Villa, he killed my uncle, right? Like or Zapata or anybody. Anybody worth applauding for did some bad shit that you're going to be able to hate him for it. That's just part of being human. So we have to zoom out emotionally here and understand that whether Castro did this intentionally or not, he expanded La Hispanidad, at least in Florida, right? Cubans built a city in Florida. As many Mexicans as there are in the Southwest, they haven't built a city. So I think we have to understand that, and see that as a major dub. Somebody like going back to this whole concept of we've been served up L's for 200 years, but we hardly ever have been able to put up dubs. You look at somebody like Maradona and playing the English, that's a little dub. But even people like Carlos Leder from Colombia, the German Colombia, he said like Colombia doesn't have an atomic bomb, but our heroin is the atomic bomb that we're going to send to the United States. So you see this Hispanista streak amongst all these men who, again, may not be of the highest order quality. These aren't Prince Charming, but they do. There is something worth rescuing from these men. That's really the point that I'm trying to say, is that they shouldn't just be thrown out and disregarded. And we fall into these boomer takes of all the damn commies. Because if we look at the reality today, for example, I'll give you guys the example of Nicaragua. The Catholic Church is more liberal than the Sandinistas, right? The Catholic Church is promoting more women's rights and tolerance and all that hippie shit. And the Sandinistas are like, no, how is it the Sandinistas, these commies supposedly, are more right-wing and conservative and traditional than the own church in Nicaragua? So again, we have to zoom out. We have to understand that in Latin America, unfortunately, the phenomenon that is built upon the Black legend was people like Castro and Che, because their worldview said, oh no, Spain is bad, right? Spain is thief and rapist. Spain bad. So they couldn't forge a movement like, let's say we can, where we can kind of be more dispassionate and look at history for what it was and say like, oh, you know what? Maybe there's something. There's some gold here that we've kind of kept hidden. They didn't have that. But at the same time, we can look at them and say, you know what, maybe there is some gold amongst these men. Maybe there is some gold amongst their accomplishments, or at the very least, there's some gold and there's symbolic value for the rest of the continent and the 700 million.
Also, what people need to realize is that like a revolution isn't pretty. It's fast but brutal at the same time. Like that's like, I hate to sound like that, but like if you want to make an omelet, bro, you gotta break some eggs.
Right. That's exactly right.
Like it sucks, but like sorry. Sorry.
Castro was just ahead of his time. We should just keep following the Russians, honestly. He was just ahead of his time. They messed up the first time with the communism.
I think the Soviet Union was the lesser evil than America.
No, yeah. I mean, there's an argument to be made for that.
Wait. Say that again. Can you guys expand on that a little bit?
I don't know about that.
Wait. Go ahead. Can you tell me what was the point?
I meant to say like that Castro was just early following the Russians, because now they got it right with how they're going, I would say, compared to how, with the communism. And then we got into the whole like,
because you're
the Soviet Union was better or not, I don't know.
Well, yeah, you're talking about how Russia has kind of reached back to its roots as well, right? Russia.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. That's what I meant. Yeah.
The Russia today. Yeah.
Yeah. Russia's a very interesting example for us Hispanos, because you see so many parallels. You see a multiracial, monocultural, ethnic empire. You see the breakdown of that empire that, at least was able to maintain much better unity, even though it became the Soviet Union and then now became the Russian Federation. You still see that unity that unfortunately you don't see in Hispanoamerica. But I think they're a good example. And what you see today is that in order for Putin to have kind of relaunched the Russian nation, he had to go back, right? He had to go back to the roots, and you see why he built up the Russian Orthodox Church. And they've established laws that are very family friendly that basically help men become the head of households. There's a lot of tax incentives. The government is really promoting family building, and it putting force behind the church is part and parcel of that. So I agree there.
Also, Russia's government has like an interesting thing where politicians and ideologues like dedicate their service to the party. Like that's what Dugin is. Like he is a dedicated ideologist for his government. Like we just don't have things like that, sadly.
Well, one thing I will say, Castro's biggest sin, in my opinion, was taking away people's land. I mean, I could get being the whole anti-American thing, but taking away people's land, I think that was wrong. That's my opinion.
Yeah. Big agree there.
I didn't hear it, but whose land was taken?
People's land. Castro took away people's land and just gave it and just basically had the state run it. I just don't agree with that,
Yeah, I think that's a complicated subject, because it's like, you don't want to take people's property, but you also don't want to have land that isn't in use, right? When there are eager peasants, who you give them a piece of land and they'll work it well and they'll develop the land. And this has always been a struggle. And let's be honest here, if you look at the history of Hispanoamerica, the governments that actually nationalized and redistributed land the most was not the communist governments. It was the right-wing military dictatorships.
Mm-hmm.
Right. But that's a different thing. In this case, in Cuba, they were not given to private property. The government kept control of it. That's what I'm saying. Like if it was, okay, we're going to take this unproductive land, give it to the peasants. That's fine. It's private property because now those peasants will have deeds. They will be able to acquire, wealth through that property. But in this case, the Cuban government kept control of the property.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. I mean, there's been, and that's the thing. That's the sad part about falling into these false dialectics. Right now, we've highlighted the racial false dialectics, right? And how they should be rejected because all they're looking is to splinter Hispanos into, 2 or 3 component parts. But the false dialectic before was capitalism versus communism, right? And it's a false choice. Those are 2 choices that are coming out of England. That has to be noted. These are 2 false choices that come straight out of England.
Always that island, huh?
Always. Well, where you're presuming that the only way to address these issues of property, land ownership, workers' rights, peasantry is only through Marx, which I think is false. There's, again, church teaching clearly teaches this stuff. And there are a lot of economists who follow the church tradition. We touched on this last time, actually. The German economics is largely based in that. So I think that's something that we should pick up. But the sad part is that this generation of Hispanos, our grandparents or parents, these boomers, they fell into that trap. And you see somebody like Chavez, who had a great opportunity to have cashed in on oil wealth and diversify the Venezuelan economy. Didn't necessarily manage that opportunity right. And now Venezuela is suffering because of it. And again, obviously, a lot of this stuff also, you can't overlook economic manipulation. Commodity prices are manipulated by the COMEX market, commodity exchange market. So we need to understand that, they can press a couple buttons and they'll fuck your entire economy up. It's not always the people managing the economy who are at fault. It's just a sad reality.
I think the person who understood the balance between economics the best, Primo de Rivera, the Spanish Falang. They were very pro-workers, but very traditionalist at the same time, and they were against usury.
Yeah. Well, that was the third way, right?
That's like how we look at things in like that third position, as we say. Like that's where those politics come from too. Like Castro would probably be better friends with Jose Antonio than he would be like any modern socialist.
I agree. I
Sorry,
think
it's just because. Go ahead.
I think if Mussolini never teamed up with Hitler and him and Franco formed their own front, I think what would happen in Latin America was the revolutionaries would have followed, Falangist Spain and fascist Italy. And Castro may have well been a fascist or Falangist in 59.
Alternative timeline. Interesting. Yeah. That could have happened, but that's why I think it's important that we touch on these somewhat taboo subjects, right? Because Castro for a lot of Cubans is like what Hitler is for, for the North, right? They just can't discuss it, right? So like you can't, you gotta throw out the baby with the bathwater, right? You can't talk about how Hitler arrested all the Freemasons, how he shut down the central bank, how when he invaded the Soviet Union, he opened up the Orthodox churches. It's just like, no, Castro bad, like Hitler bad, like, it's like the false dichotomy, like we always talk. There's more nuance to history and its leaders, and we do well to dissect it.
Yeah, and that's ultimately what I was just trying to offer. Again, when you're taking L's for 200 years, you got to work with what you got, and what we got are Pancho Villas and Zapatas and Sandinos and Castros and Guevaras and Maradonas and Escobars. So that's that in a sense, those are the biggest dubs that the 200 years of these liberal republicans have been able to produce against their enemies. When you look at the 300 years previous to that, you see nonstop dubs that we were able to put up on the board.
Something I want to touch upon, OG, you said earlier about Ortega and the Sandinistas. I bet you the Sandinistas, Ortega, the older guys, they're still the same guys who went into Managua in 79. But what's happened is the international left has gone in this wacko crazy direction that by default, the Sandinistas are now conservative, if that makes sense.
Right. Because you see, that's the thing, that the boomers get stuck. And you see this a bit with AMLO. They get stuck in Cold War rhetoric, right? Like they're still living in the Cold War. They're still using Cold War terminology. And so they might be de facto right-wing nationalist governments, but because they took a quote-unquote left position against the United States or against American imperialism, then they're stuck using that jargon.
Leftist nationalism is like what it's referred to.
Yeah, and so you even see that with somebody like AMLO, who I think is very much a nationalist, but he's stuck in some of these 60s, 70s generation worldview points, right? These little arguments, like the whole thing he did with the Catholic Church. And it's just like, well, it makes sense because he's a boomer, right? It's like, we're not going to make the boomers understand things. But we have a generation between us and these people that we're talking about today. And again, I think there are things to rescue from these people. If we understand them in the right context, it can at least kind of show a path forward, albeit a limited one.
Agreed.
I'm trying. So somebody asked, what are the thoughts on Evo Morales? So, from what I know, I have a rich Bolivian friend who didn't like Evo because, he's kind of disenfranchising some of them because they have like these kind of fiefdoms in Bolivia. And at the same time, he admitted that a lot of the stuff Evo did was like made sense for the Bolivian nation, for the country, right? He nationalized key industries. He overall did help boost the quality of life for Bolivians. And so he's kind of, my friend, he's kind of conflicted, like he has to admit that, yeah, this man was necessary and he did good things, but I'm pissed off that, the Indians are taking my land, so, from what I know, Evo is the legit leader of Bolivia, and it's unfortunate that he was taken out. But again, for me, I try not to get too emotional in things. I realize this is always going to be the case with liberal democracies. Like a liberal democracy is never going to serve the individual states of Hispanoamerica. and it's never going to serve the overall civilization.
Also, Evo was able to stay in power because he wasn't as vocal as Chavez. Like, was he was more like someone who kept his head down and just focused on his country.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. He wasn't like Chavez. Kind of took Castro's. He kind of filled that vacuum where Castro was kind of like this leader in Hispanoamerica. Chavez tried, and I think there's things that Chavez did that were kind of interesting. I think the Alba thing was very interesting. I think it was good intentioned. Again, it's just badly managed. I think largely because you're stuck in false dialectics. You're stuck.
Because there's like an interesting parallel with like Castro and Chavez. Like both come from military background and staging coups or what have you. Whereas like when I think of Evo, for some reason I think of like Lula. Like they both come from union backgrounds and seek to like focus what they have in their country. If that makes sense.
Yeah.
My impression of Evo is he comes across kind of as a bit of an indigenous. Maybe I'm reading it wrong.
No, he definitely does. Like you ever seen what he wears and all that?
Oh yeah. Again, because he's stuck in the dialectic of the Black legend, right? So and this isn't Evo's fault. He's just inherited the moment from the last 200 years. So it's like the central point is the wars of independence, because they set the pattern for many things that go wrong today. And that's a lot to kind of unpack and kind of go through and say like, shit, maybe that wasn't the best decision, but it is a necessary exercise we have to do if we want to be free to do what's right in this moment. It
was the original sin.
It was. If you can't confess your sin, right? People who go to church who understand church a bit here, then you're not free from it. Then the effects of that sin will continue to weigh you down. And that's essentially what's been happening to us. And it's only been able to benefit our historical enemies, yet God still has mercy on us, and he's giving us this very interesting demographic moment. But the reality is that if we as Hispanos don't see ourselves as a civilization, and we don't rise to this moment as a civilization, then we will pass this opportunity up. The opportunity is a lot bigger than I think a lot of us think it is. It's a lot bigger. A lot more is at stake. There's a much bigger come up if this is done right.
Yeah, and thanks to social media, we could get the message out more, because, like, for example, looking on Twitter, how we have Hispanistas from Argentina, from Spain, Mexico, people that 10, 15 years ago had these ideas but never meet up. Now we're able to communicate. Look at that Argentinian guy, Pons, his videos on YouTube about Hispanismo. That never would have been seen 20 years ago, even if people had the ideas,
Yeah. No, that's exactly right. And, it's also coinciding with the fact that we're all meeting each other, working with each other, starting businesses with each other, marrying each other in the US, right? And we're realizing that, oh shit, we're all Mexican apparently here, right? It doesn't matter what, again, your skin color, your eye color is, we're all being grouped together. And in fact, we're grouping ourselves together, right? Like in my neighborhood, like I have an Argentinian lady across the street who's married to an Ecuadorian man. And then I have, a bunch of people from Los Altos de Michoacán and Jalisco on the other side. And, everybody's a community here. My wife she's from Colombia, right? So it's an interesting moment. And I think, things like this, kind of trying to understand these men, trying to understand why you see certain phenomena in a country like Puerto Rico. And I think Puerto Rico's is like, it's like the poster child of what happens when America gets too involved in your shit. And how bad it can go either way, whether the pick-me route or the Latinxer route. And I think it could serve as a cautionary tale for the rest of us as well.
And as much as, people say, oh, Puerto Rico, part of the U.S. Commonwealth, this and that. I'm sorry. To me, it's occupied Spanish territory. And I'm not saying, oh, yeah, Spain, blah, blah, blah. But I'm being legally speaking, it is an occupied part of Spain.
And the sad part is that the modern state of Spain doesn't care and doesn't matter. to them.
They got their own issues.
We should get someone to try to sue them from the Spanish government. We just like email him.
The Vox people
the
would
only
probably
ones
do
that
it.
I was just gonna say the only ones that have shown support and interest in reunification is Vox.
Aren't they kind of like liberal at the same time?
Yeah, I don't.
Well,
they're like like you don't know how to trust them. They just seem to be the best out there. They talk a good game, that kind of sort of thing.
Here's how I
They're like
genuine political movements don't get seats in parliament. That's why I don't trust parties like them.
Well,
if they want to see you winning, they'll let you win. But if they don't want to see you winning, your party will never get off the ground. You will be arrested, and your party will be banned.
Big facts.
Yeah, so Vox came out of Pepe and its failure and its mishandling of government and all the corruption. But I know the leader of Vox has made the case against immigrants from North Africa and is in favor of more Latin Americans moving to Spain.
The leader of Vox says that
to quell the separatist movements that Spain has.
Also, the mestizaje. He probably wants some Indian blood infusion in Spain.
Can you imagine like a bunch of cholos patrolling the street of Spain for like Muslim extremists?
That would be OG's dream.
It's like, hey, yo, man, is that your Quran? That ain't gonna fly.
Yeah, the leader of Vox is, I'm paraphrasing him, but he said something along the lines like, once in a while I'm approached by a Chilean or a Mexican, and they tell me, my grandfather was from Spain or something like that. And he says, no, you are Spanish. We are the same. I don't care if you have a paper. You don't need a paper. We're blood. And the crowd erupts into like cheers and stuff. So they say nice things like that.
He's like, please come save my country.
Yeah. No, he's
and
the
more
most articulate
importantly,
speaker they have. Yeah.
In that same speech, more importantly, towards the end, he says that he's looking for direction from Iberian Americans to tell them in the peninsula, what's the way forward? Like, who are we really? And I thought that was like, a nice moment.
That's basically a cry from help. That to me is a Spaniard saying, we've lost our way. Mi hermanos in the Americas, save us. That's the way I'm viewing it as.
That's how I heard it.
Podcast.
Yeah, I've gotten that same sentiment when I've traveled to Spain. I've gotten that same sentiment to friends that I've made from Spain. I'm getting a little bit of interference from somebody. And they tell me they would say at least half of Spaniards have this outlook. I think the other half are too busy being gay, going down on each other at pride parades. But I think half of Spain realizes that like somewhere along the line, our ancestors fucked up by sticking us to France when we should have been stuck to Mexico.
The independence wars.
I think Spain. I think most or a lot of Spanish people realize this, and I think when we're talking about this kind of Hispanidad awakening, I've never heard any Spaniard of academic or philosopher in this field ever say that Spain should be the head of this movement. I've heard Mexico should be the head of this movement.
And actually, if you look at Spanish Hispanistas, whether it's Vox or the Falangist movement, whenever they draw maps of the Spanish Empire, what's always in the middle? Not Spain, the Americas, New Spain is right in the middle of that map. You see Spain on the far right, you see the Americas in the middle, and you see the Philippines on the left. That's not a coincidence.
And strangely enough, when I visited Spain, that sentiment was felt in rural Spain. Now, when I took a flight to go to Madrid and Barcelona, it was a cosmopolitan city that had their own attitudes and relatable to Madrid, Paris, London. They kind of all had the same feel, like New York City. But like the parts of Spain the rural parts I visited, they share that sentiment that what we're echoing right now.
Yeah, I think it boils down to what Rancho articulated, that half of them look to us for answers and see us as them and them as us. The other half falls with the black legend, and they play the line like, oh, pero todo lo que hizo España contra ustedes and all that. And then the big lie is that the Spanish don't want us, that they look at us, that they look down on us. That's the big lie. That's like 0%.
Anybody, any Hispano-America who's been to Spain tells you you're almost like a celebrity over there. Like wow, Dominicano, verdad? And then they start talking about like how they visited there, and then they always emphasize somos hermanos, somos el mismo pueblo. It's like every time I've been to Spain and I tell them I'm Dominican, it's like their eyes light up. It's like it does something to them. It's almost like, wow, you're a star.
Right. The Dominican neighborhood in Madrid, what is it? Cuatro Caminos. You'll find, the same foods that we love over there, the Spanish, oh, wow, you like chicharrón? Yeah, of course. Wow, I have it here too. As a matter of fact, there's a Dominican neighborhood here.
Yeah. No, I mean, it feels like Latin America, it does. It's just it's prettier on many levels, the architecture, but it's, not levels above what you'd find in Mexico, Puerto Rico, Colombia. You find these colonial towns everywhere. I would say, I haven't been, but I've heard, Southern Italy also has that same vibe. Naples, Sicily,
yes, sir,
has that same vibe. And so you see there is a greater cultural context that we can connect to. Again, we have our own sets of problems here that are a priority that we should seek. God is, again, my opinion is that God's giving us this demographic moment, and us as Hispano men will have to make that decision. Will we, take up, anime and PS5, or will we start, good, solid Christian families that are well formed, kids with very deep roots who take pride in both their indigenous and their European, and if they have it, their African admixture, and that they see themselves as members of this great civilization, which is really the way forward for us. If not, then, bye-bye everything.
And OG, another country that I'm seeing this Hispanicist reawakening, the Philippines. I'm seeing more and more in YouTube and on Twitter, Filipinos now rediscovering their Spanish roots.
Oh yeah. I've seen a lot of Filipinos. So it's interesting. It's interesting that everybody, because I think what's happening, dude, is that these generations, the Zoomers and the millennials, have realized, like, we've been sold a bunch of bullshit, and everything that they kind of been preparing us for isn't going to happen. And so now they're kind of questioning, the fundamental values of the bullshit they were sold. And so they're going back, they're investigating through history, and they're coming to something, they're picking something up that says, oh shit, this wasn't as bad as I was told, and there's more value in this than I was led to believe. And what do you know? It connects the Philippines to Mexico. You know what I mean? And it connects Mexico to Chile, California to Chile. So it's an interesting moment. Again, I think the key here is to understand things from a civilizational standpoint. I see some people kind of mentioning Dugan and stuff. I've never read Dugan. I'm roughly familiar with what he's about, in the terms of multipolarity. And, that's the factor that the way the world is going. The United States doesn't call the shots anymore as freely as it does. The United States is fastly becoming the old man of Europe, right? It was the Spanish Empire, and they used to call the Ottoman Empire that. The United States is an old man, and, empires don't last forever. So we have to ask ourselves, well, what's going to come afterwards? And we have to see ourselves as a separate pole. We can't see ourselves as part of the West. That never even worked out for Spain or the Spanish Empire. Again, I would say things like the West or white is an Anglo copyright, and we should see ourselves as our own civilizational pole in the world, the Hispano pole. Contrasting it to the Chinese or to the Russian or to the Western European or to the African or the Middle Eastern. We have to see ourselves in that light. That is the opportunity on the table. And that really means dominance of this continent by us. Us mixed race, whether literally or culturally, progeny of this empire, clashing with these nations on this continent, we will get to call that. We will get to have dominance over this continent. And the only people who can fuck that up is us.
Yeah, and once we get this continent, once we get our house right, Spain and Italy, here we come. And Philippines, come back home.
But to tie it all back into the localist level where we're at, we're all across this country, right? New York, Florida, LA. It's like Rancho says, about focusing on just what we can do and what we have, and then it all blossoms from there. It all blossoms from there, yeah.
It all comes back to the family. It all comes back to the man. So this is why I push the whole understanding of the three roots in that specific order, because you have God at the center, then you have your father, then you have your mother. So stick that into your own family that you form, and you'll be blessed. So it really comes down to that simple. I want to answer Alex real quick here. It says we're going to have the Philippines back. No. It's not about having the Philippines back, it's let's forget the LARP. Okay. We need to understand how networking works, how relationships work. Hispanidad allows Hispanoamerica to have cousins, if you want to call it that way. In Hispanoamerica, we call everybody a cousin, right? You might not be related to me, but I'm going to say this is my primo. So you have a primo in the Philippines that you can now connect and do business and trade with. And you should have that same outlook and relationship with Spain or Southern Italy, right? There is like a wider cultural matrix that we can tap into and benefit from. That's better than the UN or the EU or all this other bullshit that the Anglos made up. We can do it ourselves, and we have a culture, a heritage, a language that allow us to do it.
Exactly. We're just talking about building ourselves up. You know what I mean? We're not talking about forming one big empire. I mean, never know down the road, but we got to help ourselves, form networks, business trades, exchange of technology, exchange of know-how, like an Hispano UN, basically.
Yeah. And we know that the Anglos aren't going to allow that to happen, right? Because, they're coming into a realization of the world has never stopped spinning, right? The Chinese economy is much bigger. The Russians, never stopped their military technological advancements, and the Hispanos never stopped having kids. So it's like, here we are. Here's this moment. How will we navigate it? That's really the bigger question at hand here. And I see a lot of people talking about like, the Latinxers or these African Americans are trying to, make any Hispano with a remnant of African blood in him also an African American. And we have to know these things and learn how to combat them, learn to argue against them. But we can't like get embroiled in these dumb little battles, especially like, for example, with African Americans, in a sense, trying to imperialize, onto our people of African descent. We need to understand that African Americans are like the adopted child of Anglo America. And, if my son goes to my neighbor's yard and starts digging up his tulips, he might yell at my son, but whose fault is that? It's the father that you take it up with, correct? So we need to understand that this whole like pick a side, are we down with the blacks or are we down with the whites, is a false choice. We should be rejecting gringos, whether they're white or black. And we need to embrace our Hispanidad, because that is the only thing that we have to combat gringoism with. Otherwise, we'll become brown gringos, which is happening. I think I have a friend I think he's half white, half Persian. And he asked me, like, really the question is, will the Southwest Mexicanize before Mexico gringoizes? right? And that's the real risk, right? We need to look at gringoization. Is it coming in through forms of Protestantism? Is it coming in through a consumerist culture? Is it coming in through the music? Is it coming in through NGOs? These are things that our governments aren't even asking themselves, right? Our governments are not at all registering this. But that's a very crucial question. Will the Southwest Mexicanize in time before Mexico gringoizes? That's a legit existential question that we should all be asking ourselves.
Yeah, I mean, you've seen what happened in Spain, how they got Francophized. Now the question is, like your friend says, will the Southwest Hispanicize in time, or will Mexico fall to gringo culture? Which you see in Mexico City, it's practically a gringo city, sadly.
Culturally, yeah, it's values. And I think a lot of Mexicans, a lot of my friends are from kind of Jalisco. They're more from the West, Sinaloa area. And, even in the rural Jalisco, I should say, and they hate Guadalajara and the culture that's kind of sprung out there. And I see the same dynamic in Colombia, between paisas and costeños. They hate Bogota, right? Because of the culture that's springing up there. And so, again, how are we this is a culture war that's going on, right? It's not kinetic right now, right? Mexico and the United States aren't exchanging bullets. But the thing is, the United States doesn't fight wars like that anymore. If it can infect your culture, if it can, undermine your institutions, and I'm talking about family and church, then it doesn't matter. I don't need to fight. I don't need to send troops with bullets because you'll be taken in from the inside. And so the question is, how do we fight a culture war back? Well, it starts with embracing our roots. It starts with understanding ourselves as men and our relationship to God. It comes to understanding this demographic opportunity and moment that we're being given. What's the best way to take advantage of it? To form families. Well, what's the best way to form families? Okay, well, we can get into that conversation now. What's the right outlook for us pochos in the diaspora to say, okay, this is an interesting moment for pochos, right? This is an interesting moment for Hispanos born in the U.S., or raised in the U.S., because we have access to capital here that Hispanos don't necessarily have down there. We can finance business projects, and I don't just mean money and capital, but experience, professional experience, networking experience. Like being where I'm from, I've learned Farsi, right? I dated a Persian girl for way too long, and I learned Farsi. Well, now I can connect with Persians in a way that might be beneficial to Hispanoamerica, right? Or Chinese or Russians or whatever. We have opportunities, experience, capital here that will pay us dividends if we take it back home. And if we have networks, then all these nodes in the network will feed each other, right? A business opportunity popping off in Nicaragua might be able to translate into Guatemala. It might be able to translate into Chiapas, right? It might be able to translate into Cuba. And now you have a business network that expands, and that's how you do it. That's how you do it, gentlemen.
That's the second part for sure. And the first part you've already mentioned several times, that the answer to whether Mexico is going to adopt jam culture first, well, that's going to be answered collectively by the fathers of each Mexican home. We have to get our houses in order. And we'd probably do well to do an episode on that, on how to get your house in order, how to make sure that you're building a strong Christian family that's rooted in Christ and it's going to be unshakable when the jam storm comes.
Yeah, don't worry, y'all. A self-help book is on the way.
I just want to
we got you.
We're gonna do a course in Colorado.
and to the brothers of the Venezuelan and Cuban diaspora, if you can't go back home to do business, we'll invite you to all our countries.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, we all have friends. This is learn to make friends. Learn to ingratiate yourself with people. Learn to have people be proud of their relationship with you and think of you when they're coming into opportunities. These are important skills to have. I want to bring up Vader Kurt's point here that said, just don't get involved with the U.S. far too much. We're winning a lot. My family still kept their Spanish roots. I'm all about that. And that's the problem that the Anglos are having with Hispanos. And if you read Huntington's article, again, I would recommend look up the episode that we did as a 2-part episode, the WASP take on Hispanos. We go through it. We go into it very well. This is the problem they're having, right? The problem they're having is that Hispanics are not assimilating. You can argue that, Cubans in Florida are, but even he says this is kind of more of a lip service assimilation. They're still preserving their ethnic roots and the worldview. And that's really what it's about. It's about conflicting worldviews. Is your worldview Queen Elizabeth or is it Queen Isabel? Those are the two emblematic queens that we have to really contrast the point that we're trying to make. Is it based on alchemy and commercialism, or is it based on civilization, Christianity, Rome, right? So those are things to take into mind.
Yeah, maybe El Pingu could expand on that a little bit about how the Cubans are, just paying lip service into America. Because I feel like in Puerto Rico, something similar is going on. It's not like we're gonna start showing up, 5 minutes early. It's not like we're gonna stop with the siestas. It's not like we're gonna stop speaking Spanish. So I don't know, Pingu. You're in Miami, ¿verdad?
Yeah. So I'm from Miami. Yeah. I would say that in general, so like I'm in my 20s, right? So I'll start with like let's say my parents' generation. That's definitely the case. Like let's say you have a more Spanish sounding name, but you want to like move up quicker in your global, your national corporation. You make it a little bit more Anglo sounding, so Ernesto will become Ernie or things like this nature, but nobody out here is trying to be like, oh, I'm white or whatever like that. It's more, if anything, the only thing that we have here is more of like a classism that happens with like recent newcomers, where it's like a whole thing where you got to learn how to speak English and that type of thing. But it's more classism, because it's a whole other thing. It has nothing to do with whether you want to assimilate to like white Anglo culture. It's more so like, I don't know, it's a whole other complication too, because some people, it's interesting to me thinking about how Cubans assimilate here, especially in Miami, because, for example, you guys are talking about buying, saving up cash and buying land, back home, right? A lot of Cubans in their minds, that's not a reality, when Rancho said earlier que los Cubans, they go back and forth a lot, that's a newer generation thing as well. So those the ones that have come in more recently, like post Marielito, I don't know what that would be, but those.
Oh yeah, that's a good way.
Yeah. Those are more like that. Like they come back and forth, no hay lío, they don't give a shit, right? So I would say what we would have to be cautious of is when somebody of my generation, when like the firstborn here or the secondborn here, when they go off to, let's say, I don't know, some college over in like DC or Villanova or one of these places up there, they don't get that stuff metido in their head, because anybody can get indoctrinated with and the bobería that they pitch in these colleges, no? So and that's where you get the false choice. Luckily and why I say that having a whole influx of different cultures and in general, not just Cubans, come to Florida is good too, because when I was in school, that's what made me really realize, like, because I first, like, I never was like, yo, I'm super Hispanic. In my head, I was like a white ethnic person, you know what I mean? Like an Italian or like an Irish, but I was not a fucking, like, you know what I mean? Like a white person.
If I may ask real quick, so like, have you traveled like outside of Miami? Because like, even as going as far to like Broward, it's a different.
Oh yeah. No. Everybody knows that. Everybody knows that as soon as you drive like a couple miles north, you're in another country. Like everybody's aware of that's perfectly fine. Like everybody knows that.
Right.
I don't know if you guys ever saw a video. I'm sorry, but my brain works and like I go from one thing to another. But there was a video that got really popular here one time of like I think they were like black gringos going through a Taco Bell, and this lady at the top, it was in Hialeah.
Yeah, I
don't know if you guys
remember
know
that.
you saw that. Yeah. So
Yeah.
no, that's kind of the.
Wait, what
That's how
happened?
it is.
What happened?
Well,
tell us.
the lady didn't know how to speak English. The worker at Taco Bell, she spoke straight Spanish. In Hialeah, that's how it is. And a majority of Hialeah, it's straight Cubans.
Like 95% of Hialeah is Cuban. Like what is
Uh-huh.
known as the city proper, right?
Yeah, exactly. And so
Si
they
no
got into a
habla,
whole argument. They got into a whole argument. The Cuban lady there was like, si tú no entiendes, esto es Hialeah, aquí tienes que hablar en español, si no te gusta, pues vete. And then it became like a whole scandal. It was funny. Yeah.
Pero once you cross like the train tracks in Hialeah, it's a different neighborhood. It's
Oh yeah, for sure. There's a black neighborhood like right around there.
That's why that was probably where they were from.
Yeah.
Yeah,
No, but majority of the time it's amicable relationships. It's not really. We don't really get no beef.
No, absolutely.
No, that's the truth. My grandmother's sister used to live in Okeechobee and 16th Street, and when I was walking around that neighborhood, you never ever heard English ever. I mean, it was total takeover.
But
I remember the first time I went to Miami and someone asked me, "Oh, where are you from?" My response was like, "Oh, New York." No. Like, like we're all like.
Yeah.
Oh, Dominican. Yeah. Wow. I thought you was Colombia. I thought you was this and that. And I'm like, wow, yeah. So we started chopping it up from there.
Yeah. But to continue, the younger, for example, I have one of my brother's friends, which is my friend as well, but he's kind of very gringonized. Like he barely speaks any Spanish, which, I mean, he does, but he just to get by. To the point he basically considers himself like Italian, like he separates himself from like Mexican is like another thing, bro. Like, what are you talking about? I'm Cuban, bro. Mexican is like a complete. I'm like, bro, you're an idiot. You don't know what the fuck you're talking about. That's very rare though. That's not like that guy's just an idiot. But what happens is you either you live in your little Miami bubble like this kid, and he's never gone anywhere and interacted with anybody else, because Miami is a bubble, and so that affects people in a whole different. It's a bubble. So if you don't leave, sometimes you can get this guy's dumbass mentality. Yeah, or you can leave and then you can get infected by the little college propaganda, and then you come back and you're like, no, okay, we're Latinx and the struggle against whatever oppressed people, and we're actually super black, and abuelo super racist. You can't be saying that at the table, abuelo. That type of stuff.
There's Cubans in Miami that actually be like, we're super racist.
Huh? What do you mean?
Like, I know Cuban kids were always a little bit more conservative, but now there's actually like Cuban Latinx kids in Miami and all that.
Oh yeah. There's Cubans that buy, of course, bro. That's like in any community. What do you think? I mean, it's not like Cubans were like voted 100% conservative. There's
Hey, Pingu, and from your experience, their parents don't grab them by the neck and say something like, "Deja de estar comiendo tanta mierda con ese Latinx."
No, they do. That's the thing, is that type of stuff comes from, once again, obviously, guess from what type of home? Do you think they had the dad was there to grab them by the neck to do that type of stuff? No. So, that's always a root problem.
Yeah. Soft homes. The homes.
Yeah.
What do you hear? Alex asked a good question, Pingu. What do you think
What did he say?
about Cuban support for Anglo intervention in Latin America?
I think it's just.
Let me pause real quick. I don't know why he calls it Cuban support. I just think the rich Cubans, the rich Venezuelans, and the rich Nicaraguans. Yeah, it's just the Venezuelans, the Cubans, and the Nicaraguans are a much smaller community. They all vibe together because they all hate the government back home. But I wouldn't necessarily. So they're going to use the same political structures that are already established in Southern Florida, right? They're going to use. They're going to lobby to the same congressman and senator because he's representing them as well. So
right, and
I wouldn't characterize that as the Cubans are scheming to get into Venezuela or Nicaragua. No, it's just the elites of Venezuela and Nicaragua, don't like the governments back home.
Yeah, exactly. They all lobbied together.
They all formed a coalition as a voting bloc, and it showed in the last election, as we saw. And now we have and then when they vote back home, they vote for the more conservative candidate in hopes of returning back home and saving the, what they once lost. So yeah.
Yeah. So what have you noticed about that, Bingu?
About what exactly?
That voting bloc who kind of is like, yeah, let's take out Daniel Ortega or whoever they want to take out this week.
Bro, it's just all about communism, and they got grudges about stuff that happened back home, and they're stuck in that materialistic. If it's either communist or it's capitalism, it's either for my freedom or you know what I mean. They don't think about it in any larger scale. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's they fall into the boomer takes, and again, Alex brought up the point that these Cubans buy the Anglo freedom bullshit narrative of the. I don't know if they buy it. I know they pay lip service to it, but I wouldn't say that they buy it. Is like there's like a Cuban public face that when the Univision newscaster's outside with her microphone, like a Cuban has like a set talking points that he feels like he has to say, but like when we're chilling and we're all just barbecuing, having beer, he's not saying the same thing. So I don't think you can take at face value what is being said in the media or what the media likes to echo, because I think the reality on the ground is a little bit more nuanced than that.
Right. What was like so shocking to me about visiting my cousins who are from Florida is that dominates the conversation. The Univision and Telemundo, Jorge Ramos, whatever, Jorge Ramos' daughter, it's worse. Giving the rhetoric of, I guess everything in Miami is about communism, and I was like, wait, in Massachusetts we have healthcare for all, everyone is covered, and unions are strong for the laborer, and in Florida, this argument against that is the blanket, communism. And I don't think that's how we build a cohesive society, but I understand where that's coming from, and the coalition and the voting bloc, et cetera. Yeah.
East Coast Cubans are a little different, like as we discussed in New Jersey and all that.
Right. Where the Cubans in Jersey vote, they tend to vote Democrat, and they tend coefficient like Portuguese, Unionists, blah, 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 where in Miami it's complete opposite.
Yeah, it's funny because like every like pro Castro Cuban I ever met is either from New Jersey or New York.
There you go.
Bueno, regardless what you think about these characters, I think most of us see them, that there's good things we could pick up from them and bad things that we should probably drop. But I want to hear Pingu's take on this, because the way I see it is that, when the revolution happened, the first Cubans to leave Cuba to Miami were, wealthy Cubans who had a lot to lose and had a huge grudge with the Cuban government, and being powerful and being the first ones there, so to speak, they create the environment, they set the rules. And so the mantra es que comunismo no sirve, quítate esa camisa de Che, and from there, you have this space que just rapidly, just feels this way. But I think that's how I think it came to be. ¿Qué tú crees, Pingu? Is that what happened?
No, that's 100% on the head there. No, and that's how it, the whole Bay of Pigs and all that happened, was because the first Cubans that came like in the 60s, 70s and went to Miami were the ones with money. You know what I mean? So like when you talk about like Miami aristocracy, we're talking about people with actual money. Like if you look up Jorge Mas, that guy has bread. Like he has a huge company. So
yeah, but to that, and you can correct me if I'm wrong. That first wave of Cubans in Miami, I understand it from their circumstance. One, they couldn't go back to Cuba. Two, they wanted to return to what they had. And then three, it was like, okay, fine, we're here. But the Miami in the 60s is not the Miami we know today. It was desolated, and there was, there was opportunity to build and establish.
Well, that's what's funny about how Rancho says it. Where Castro maybe he did it on purpose or by accident, but he did send out a colony when he flooded it in the 80s. You know what I mean? Like with my parents and everybody else, bro, because it was a retirement home. So first the people with the people with the money showed up to set up like infrastructure, and then a whole bunch of people showed up afterwards, and then it never stopped after that until Obama stopped, wet foot, and people still keep coming.
No, and with that, I mean, that's indicative to the economic model of the United States, where it's like you see opportunity, you build, grow, and etc. But so yeah, no, I understand like how that came to be.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Alex had touched on a point about, like these elites and the political machines. Again, we've talked about this in other episodes, but I'll kind of repeat it quickly is, the Cubans have established a political machine in South Florida. And it's like you said, the first wave of Cuban immigrants, were of money and they had power. And they threw it into establishing a political machine. And so the political machine today comes from that. But I don't see what's there to really get hung up on about that. I don't see it as an existential threat. I think, in fact, I see it as an opportunity, because the big problem, when people kind of call dubs of like the Mexicans, like, oh yeah, we're such a big portion of the population in the Southwest and Texas. It's like, they're already, smoking cigars, celebrating, running victory laps and shit when they haven't even started the actual struggle for it. But one thing to note is that class has a lot to do with society, and I'm not necessarily saying like being a classist here, though I do believe in hierarchy. So by default, I do believe there is class, there is a harmony, right? In a family, the mother and father must take on roles, the children must take on roles for the family to operate, much the same a nation. And this forces me to kind of take more of a medieval ideal and understanding how society should work. But regardless, the point is that you're not going to take over anything and control it if you don't have elites amongst your ranks, right? If you don't have your own native organic elite, if you haven't developed an elite, a noble class per se, then it's very hard to manage things. It's very, essentially you're just the workforce. But there needs to be an elite and a nobility developed. And I think what's and I'm not saying that the Cuban elite of Miami should be the elite across Pocholandia or whatever, but there is a symbiosis there that's just waiting to really be activated. And
right.
And I think you're already seeing it with Pochos who've been here for 1 or 2 generations, and maybe they married a Cuban girl, or they, maybe they went to school in New York, and so they kind of have a more cosmopolitan view of things. They'll start going to Miami, they'll start building these relationships, and so now you're seeing like a new kind of ecosystem develop. And we kind of touched on that earlier, but yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, about that, right? Like Brico is the financial elite, and the artisan elite in Miami goes to Wynwood. Yeah, and with that power, that is what we know. Then I wanted to bring up like with my experience in Boston, like Lawrence and all those areas were revitalized by Dominican businesses and Puerto Ricans and whatnot, but they weren't able to, I guess because the elites didn't go there. So like, the political climate is weak and all that. And what you have in Miami is like, Rancho, what you mentioned, right? The second generation New Yorker could say, oh, well, let me go to Miami. It's comfortable. I'm still a citizen here, right? But I also have proximity to Latin America. Come to find once you're there and you move there, you like, you get this like, let's call it a culture shock to many who are in the Northeast. And yeah, you start building from there. Yeah.
Yeah. Now you can access Latin America, right? Like, as an entrepreneur, I go to Miami, I'm able to sell to all of Hispanoamerica from Miami. So, and we have to thank the Cubans for establishing that, and the Colombians. You were saying, Angela?
And the Colombians.
Yeah, we have to because they put up a lot of the money for it.
It's funny because I'm from New York and I should be in Florida, like moved in by September, like next September.
Yeah,
I'll see you there. I'll meet you there.
Yeah, because then I plan to go back and forth to Cuba, honestly, at that point, because it's cheap, blah, blah, blah.
Hit me up if you need the loan.
Bet I'm about to go to the Cuban government. I will start a pro-Cuban newspaper in Miami, but I'm going to need some money.
Yeah, Alex had brought up a point about like how you're going to connect these, how you're going to connect the Cubans and the Mexicans if they're not in the same area. One of the things that I've noticed is that I know a lot of Mexicans. I live in LA, obviously, who have a condo in Miami, who have a warehouse out of Miami. These are businessmen. These are second or third generation Hispanos, and they're very Mexican and they do business out of Miami because again, if you're gonna serve customers in Colombia, Venezuela, Peru, Brazil, Argentina, what you're gonna go to every single one of those countries? No, you just go to Miami and open up shop, and from there it takes care of itself. Miami is a hub of Hispanoamerica. Somebody had brought up about communism. They're against the church and all that. Angelo, I had heard you talk about the issues with Castro in the church. Could you expand on that a bit?
What I noticed with most communists, and like I brought this up, a lot of communists have grown up with religious people, like either be their mothers or going to a religious school. So that religion's always with them, like in their natural life, as like even if they don't want to admit it, like if you grow up close to something, it's going to be part of you forever. But also with Castro and them, they're like very superstitious old people when it comes to like Anglo and Western influence, and I guess they see it like how we do with the Catholic Church. They're like, the West is in there, and all that. Like they saw the church as foreign to them.
And you're speaking of the Catholic Church.
Yes.
All right. Where there's a contrast with Santeria, Castro was more receptive to that. Like that's part of like the nation's fabric.
Yes, that's like iffy, but how I've seen it is, especially in the East Coast, Santeria is just like used as folklore to keep kids in line and like to keep you from doing bad things. I don't know if it's taken as much seriously on the island, but at the end of the day, like the Santeria priests, when things go wrong, they don't get on their knees and like pray to Agun. They pray to Jesus Christ. Like it's just a weird synchronized folk religion of the island.
No, Santeria is huge in the island right now. I can tell you that for a fact. People make money off of that. Like that's a huge business.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. Like, I don't know if you know who Joey Diaz is, but he made a good point saying Santeria is a business now than a spiritual religion.
No, that's
it's become commercial. It's become commercialized. Like what's the mystical Jewish one? Kabbalah. Something like that.
Kabbalah Harris.
Kabbalah Harris.
but the same thing is being done with Santeria. So like watered down. Let's invite celebrities. I think even there was a picture of like not Samuel Jackson Whitaker, right? The guy with the lazy eye, like in a Hollywood Santeria party that had, it was just it just looked superficial on the
and
it
it's
just
crazy
looked superficial
like,
picture.
This new like marketized Santeria is like the Christian aspects of it, which kind of always made it interesting to me, is like gone too from it.
Right. It goes back to being watered down and opening the doors to money and wearing all white to Hollywood.
It is ingrained in the culture though, because like for example, I follow like these comedians. They were born in Cuba. Like all they do is in Spanish. So
and
they
talk
did
about
a
like
little
a goon
skit.
and shit.
Yeah, no, like they'll do jokes. Like just because recently they did a little skit when the Heat were in the playoffs, and what if the Miami Heat were Cubans and like half the jokes were about them being Santeros. You know what I mean? So
oh yeah, I saw that one.
Yeah, it was funny. Yeah, Los Peachy Boys.
Okay. I mean, what are some other points that I had here? I think that's pretty much it, man. I think we covered everything. We've actually been going on for a little while here. Anybody got any final points? We didn't really expand too much on the Pick Me Latinxer thing. Obviously, we did touch on it, but we didn't really go too deep into it. I don't think we need to be honest. I think by now, hopefully, the viewer knows. If not, go back towards the beginning. You'll see some episodes on the Pick Me phenomenon and the Latinxer phenomenon and our stance on it. But yeah, I'll open it up to you guys if you guys want to close with anything.
Nah, good
Bueno.
talk. Good first
Go ahead.
edition of Caribbean Poppy Hour.
Well, you know, full disclosure, I'm working on relocating to Miami, so
Let's get it. Start the capital going.
Yeah,
We'll have the podcast live from fucking Miami.
Yes,
Go
sir.
from the rancho in Homestead.
We're all smoking cigars and drinking coffee. There's a fucking cockfight in the background.
An actual meetup, all are invited.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, guys.
I was gonna say I'm relocating too sometime soon, but it's a surprise. So
yeah,
I guess we'll have to tune into the next episodes, right? We'll be back.
We're putting it out there, and hopefully the universe sends it back. But that's the goal. That's the goal, right?
Mm-hmm.
Bueno, I got one foot over there. I have my mother in Delray Beach, just 45 minutes north. And that's United States. That's not Dade County, but yeah, I have a foot
No,
there.
Delray's nice. Delray's nice.
Yeah, it's a nice little town. I just gotta get used to las calores esa the whole year, you know? No four seasons, just calor, humedad, and a lot of baby powder in la bola.
Yeah, no, you just get used to having sweaty pits all the time, bro. It's just a thing.
But not Rancho to close, you know, talking about the Caribbean and Puerto Rico in particular, you know, I just want to re-stress that no matter the situation that island finds itself in, the cultural game, I feel like it's still strong. And we got to capitalize on that.
Yeah, I think I wish we talked more with Puerto Ricans on the island. I knew two who would have been great for the discussion. Maybe they'll come back another time. But you know, we've talked about this. Puerto Rico, Dominican Republic, and I would say Mexico are like front lines of the culture war. And sadly, it's within Mexico you see it, but you see it within the Pochos out here in the U.S. A lot of the Latinxers, rank and file, are Mexican Americans. But you know, again, you know, we got to focus on what we can do. We have to understand things in the right order, in the right way, and we have to see the opportunity that's being gifted to us. And I think we focus on that, and all these other things start to take care of themselves. We don't have to be, you know, Jewish Anglo schemers and plotters and, you know, have all these plots lined out. Like, it's just going to happen by itself. If you do things right, if you start a family, you do it the right way, you take your kids to church, you are the man you're supposed to be. You are that steward. Things will start taking care of themselves. I am living proof of that.
Amen.
Yes, amen. Yeah. Yes, en la casa. The cell. We got to work on the cell.
Yeah.
We get the cells right, we'll get the organs right. We get the organs right, we'll get the system right.
Yes, sir.
The virgin scheming and plotting versus the Chad just popping out some babies.
Yeah. Exactly. Right. And that's really what we're seeing happen. Okay, you guys, you have a good night. Se me cuidan, and we'll talk soon.